It was June 1984, and we were young and broke, just trying to enjoy a cheap camping weekend in our beat-up '76 Ford pickup. Looking back, I wish we'd picked anywhere else to sleep that night. We'd found this spot off the main road, maybe 15 miles from Interstate 64. The area was heavily wooded, typical Virginia forest with lots of oak and pine trees. We'd been there once before during the day and thought it'd make a decent camp spot, secluded enough to be peaceful, but not so far out that we'd get completely lost. The weather was mild that night, probably in the mid-60s, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to see shapes and shadows. Being on a tight budget, we'd brought along some hamburgers and hot dogs we'd grilled for dinner. I remember distinctly hanging our garbage bags in a tree, something my dad always taught me to do when camping to keep bears and other animals away from our sleeping area. The branch I chose was pretty high up, probably around 8 feet off the ground. I'm 5'8", and I had to jump a couple times just to get the bags looped over it. We'd set up the back of the truck with some blankets and sleeping bags, and I'd rigged up a tarp over the bed in case it rained. It wasn't the Hilton, but it worked for us. Sarah, my wife, and I had been lying there for maybe an hour, just talking quietly and enjoying the night sounds. Crickets, occasional owl calls, that sort of thing. It must have been around 11:30 p.m. when Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm. At first, I thought she'd heard a bear or something, which wouldn't have been unusual for the area. But when I turned to look at her, her face was white as a sheet. She was staring intently past the tailgate of the truck. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, like someone walking very slowly through the underbrush. Not the random movement you'd expect from a deer or even a bear, but deliberate steps. The crickets had gone quiet too, which I know now should have been our first warning. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The moon was casting weird shadows through the trees, but what stepped into view wasn't a shadow. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see it with perfect clarity. This thing, and I hesitate to call it a creature because it moved too purposefully, was massive. I've seen black bears in the wild, and this was both taller and broader. It was covered in what looked like dark hair, though in the moonlight I couldn't make out the exact color. What struck me most was how it moved, completely upright, on 2 legs, with arms that hung down much longer than any humans would. It walked right up to our garbage bags, and this is what really gets me. It didn't reach up or struggle at all. It simply lifted its arm and grabbed one of the bags, the same bags I had to jump to hang up. The movement was so casual, like someone picking an apple from a low branch. Sarah, God bless her, did probably the bravest and dumbest thing she could have done. She hit the horn on our truck. The sound cut through the night like a knife, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. But the creature, it just turned and looked at us. No running, no startled movement. It just looked. I'll never forget those eyes catching what little moonlight there was. They weren't glowing or red or anything dramatic like that. They were just aware, intelligent. It stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, holding our garbage bag like it was nothing. Then, with the same deliberate movement, it turned and walked back into the tree line. Not running, not scared, just walked away. Sarah and I sat there, barely breathing, for what must have been a good 20 minutes. I had my hunting knife out, for all the good it would have done. Then, just when we were starting to think maybe we should make a run for it, we heard those footsteps again. It came back. Same deliberate walk, same casual movement. This time it took the second bag, and again when Sarah hit the horn, she later told me she did it out of pure nervous reaction, it just turned and looked at us again, like we were the ones who were out of place. We didn't stick around for a third visit. As soon as it disappeared into the trees, we scrambled into the cab of the truck. I don't think I've ever started a vehicle so fast in my life. We spent the rest of the night parked at a rest stop off I-64, too wired to sleep. The next morning, we went back, partly to prove to ourselves we hadn't imagined it, partly to retrieve anything we'd left behind in our hurry. The garbage bags were gone, but we found them about 50 yards into the woods, picked clean of any food scraps. What really shook me were the footprints. The ground was fairly hard, but near some softer soil by a fallen log, we found one partial print. It was huge, easily 16 inches long, and deeper than any human or bear print I've ever seen. We did eventually camp in that area again, years later. Never saw anything unusual after that night. But to this day, I hang on to two distinct memories. The casual strength it showed in reaching those bags, and those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. Every time I read about Bigfoot sightings or hear someone dismiss them as bears or hoaxes, I think about those eyes and that deliberate walk. I don't tell this story often. Most people either think you're crazy or start asking all sorts of questions I can't answer. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it was there or where it went. All I know is what Sarah and I saw that night was real, and it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in those Virginia woods. One thing's for certain. I've never hung garbage bags in trees while camping since then. Some things you only need to learn once. It's been over 40 years, but the memory is as clear as if it happened yesterday. I've read other people's encounters online recently, and I finally feel ready to share our experience. It was August 30th, 1980, and the summer heat was just starting to ease up in Virginia. Tom and I had driven out to the surrender fields near Amelia Courthouse for his evening hunt. He'd been hunting in that area for years. We're talking prime whitetail territory, with sprawling agricultural fields bordered by dense woodland. The surrounding farmland was mostly corn and soybeans back then, and the transition between the fields and forest created perfect spots for deer to graze at dusk. We arrived around 5:30 p.m. in our old Ford pickup. The plan was simple. Tom would do some scouting and hopefully get a deer, while I stayed in the truck reading my book. I'd never been much for hunting myself, but I enjoyed the peaceful evening drives and quiet time. The surrender fields were historically significant, some Civil War connection that Tom always talked about, but to us, they were just good hunting grounds. The weather was unusually mild for late August in Virginia. There was a light breeze, and the sun was still pretty high, though it would be setting in a couple of hours. I remember noticing how the cornfields swayed gently in the wind, creating that familiar rustling sound that you get used to in rural areas. Tom grabbed his Remington 700 and his orange vest, gave me a quick kiss, and headed out toward his usual spot near this massive old oak tree about 200 yards from where we'd parked. I could see him clearly from the truck, since the fields were pretty open, with just scattered trees here and there. I settled in with my romance novel, occasionally glancing up to check on Tom's position. Everything was normal for about an hour. I saw Tom moving slowly along the edge of the field, checking for deer signs and occasionally stopping to glass the area with his binoculars. But then something changed. I noticed it first in the atmosphere. You know that feeling when the air gets heavy before a storm? It was like that, but different. The breeze had died down completely, and the usual evening sounds just stopped. What really caught my attention was how Tom was acting. He'd been hunting since he was a kid with his dad, and I'd never seen him move the way he did then. He was still crouched in his hunting position, but his body language was all wrong, tense, alert, like something had spooked him bad. I watched him slowly back away from his position, his rifle raised slightly, moving with a deliberation that made my stomach knot up. When he got back to the truck, his face was pale. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, this mixture of fear and disbelief that made my heart start racing before he even said anything. He climbed in quickly and immediately told me to roll up my window, leaving just a tiny crack for air. His hands were shaking as he pointed toward that big oak tree he'd been near. "Look," he whispered, "by the oak, but don't make any sudden movements." At first I didn't see anything unusual. The sun was getting lower, creating long shadows across the field. But then I saw movement, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Around the massive trunk of that oak tree, there were two figures. I hesitate to call them animals because their movements were too deliberate, too coordinated. But they certainly weren't human either. They were huge. That's what struck me first. Even at that distance, I could tell they were massive. They were moving in this strange, crouched way around the tree, almost like they were playing some kind of game. Their fur, and yes, I could clearly see they were covered in dark, shaggy fur, was a deep brown color that almost blended with the bark of the oak tree. Then one of them, the larger one, peered around the tree directly at our truck. the eye shine in the fading daylight. I'll never forget it. They were too far away for me to make out facial features clearly, but I could feel it watching us. The intelligence in that gaze made my blood run cold. This wasn't an animal looking at us. This was something evaluating us. The strangest part, and this is what still haunts me, was the sound of children laughing and playing that seemed to be coming from that direction. But there were no children out there. The nearest farm was over a mile away, and sound doesn't carry like that in open fields. The laughter was clear as day, but it had this weird quality to it, almost like it was coming from underwater or underground. Tom and I sat there, barely breathing for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes. The creatures continued their bizarre behavior around the tree, occasionally stopping to look in our direction. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible for their size. I'd estimate they were at least 7 or 8 feet tall when standing upright, though they stayed crouched most of the time we watched them. The sun was setting fast now, and the shadows were getting longer. The children's laughter had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was even more unnerving. No crickets, no birds, no wind in the corn, nothing. Just this heavy, waiting silence that pressed against my eardrums. Then, without any warning or obvious trigger, both creatures simply disappeared behind the oak tree. We waited, expecting them to reappear on the other side, but they never did. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. A few minutes later, the normal evening sounds slowly started to return. Crickets chirping, birds calling their evening songs, the rustle of corn in the breeze. Tom started the truck with shaking hands, and we left immediately. The whole drive home we barely spoke. What could we say? We'd just seen something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. Tom, who'd been hunting those fields since he was a teenager, didn't go back there for nearly 2 years afterward. We did report it to the local sheriff's office the next day, but you can imagine how that went. They politely took our statement, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. We later heard rumors that other people had seen strange things in that area over the years, but no one wanted to talk about it openly. The thing that stays with me most isn't just the visual memory of those creatures, though that's vivid enough. It's the complete wrongness of the situation, the unnatural silence, that mysterious children's laughter, the way they moved with such purpose and intelligence. There was something deeply unsettling about how they behaved, like they were fully aware of us and almost putting on some kind of show. Tom passed away last year, and going through his old hunting journals, I found his entry from that day. He'd written only one line: saw something in the surrender fields, never going back. He did eventually return to hunting there, but he never went alone again, and he always left well before sunset. I still drive past that area occasionally, and sometimes I'll catch myself looking for that old oak tree. It's still there, standing alone in the field. I've never seen anything unusual there since that day, but I never stop either. Some experiences change how you see the world, and after what we saw that evening, I've never been able to look at isolated trees in open fields the same way again. I know how this story must sound to others. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before it happened to us, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what we saw that day. Those creatures were real, whatever they were, and sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I still wonder about them. Were they really playing some kind of game? What was the purpose of that strange behavior? And most unsettling of all, where did they go when they disappeared behind that tree? I've never been able to explain it, and at my age now, I've made peace with the fact that I probably never will. But I know what I saw, and now you know too. I've carried this story with me for almost 50 years now, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about what happened that night in Pennsylvania County. I was 15 years old back in '76, and my best friend Tommy and I had this weird hobby of collecting beer cans along Old Millers Road. I know it sounds stupid now, but back then we thought we were pretty cool adding to our collection. That particular night, October 15th, 1976, started like any other Friday night. The air was crisp, and there was this weird stillness that you only get in Virginia during fall. We'd been out there maybe an hour after sunset, using our flashlights to spot discarded cans in the ditches. The moon was nearly full, which helped with visibility, but the trees created these deep shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. I need to mention that this wasn't our first strange experience in that area. For about 2 years prior, we'd been seeing something that our parents kept dismissing as probably just someone in a costume trying to scare kids. But we knew better. You don't forget the feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. We were about a mile down Old Miller's Road, past where the pavement ends and it turns to gravel, when everything just stopped. The crickets, the occasional owl calls, even the slight breeze through the trees, all of it just died. Tommy and I had experienced this before, and we both knew what it meant. Something was there. I remember my hand starting to shake so bad I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The beam was bouncing all over the place, creating these crazy shadows that made everything worse. Tommy whispered, "Mike," and I knew he was feeling it too. That heavy feeling in the air, like right before a massive thunderstorm, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Then it happened. Right in the middle of the road, maybe 40 feet ahead of us, it just appeared. I don't mean it jumped out or walked out. 1 second the road was empty and the next it was there. The thing that still haunts me to this day is how it moved. It took one step, just one, and covered about 6 feet of ground like it was nothing. The movement was so fluid, so unnaturally smooth, that my brain couldn't process it properly. I'd never seen it this clearly before. In our previous encounters, it had always been partially hidden by trees or darkness, but this time I saw everything. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe even more. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, probably around 4 feet across, and its entire body was covered in this dark, matted, I don't even know if you'd call it fur. In the moonlight, it looked almost blue-black, like the color of a crow's feathers. The smell hit us next, this overwhelming mixture of wet dog and something rotting. It was so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. My flashlight beam caught its face for just a split second, and I wish it hadn't. The eyes reflected back this reddish-orange color, like dying embers, and they were set deep under a massive brow ridge. Its face looked almost human-like, but wrong in ways I can't properly explain. The weird thing is, it didn't make any aggressive moves toward us. It just stood there, swaying slightly, those eyes fixed right on us. But that was enough. I've never felt terror like that before or since. It was primal, like every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. Tommy moved first. He let out this choked sound, not quite a scream, more like a whimper, and took off running back the way we came. I was right behind him, dropping my flashlight in the process. I could hear it hit the gravel and roll, but there was no way in hell I was going back for it. The really messed up part. As we ran, there was no sound of pursuit, no heavy footsteps, no crashes through the underbrush, nothing. Just that same dead silence that had preceded its appearance. Somehow, that was worse than if it had chased us. We ran the whole mile back to the paved road, then another half-mile to Tommy's house. His mum found us on the front porch, both of us hyperventilating and crying. When we tried to explain what happened, the words wouldn't come out right. His parents called my parents, and of course, nobody believed us. They said we'd scared ourselves with our own imaginations, that we'd probably seen a bear, that we were too old to be making up stories. The next day, Tommy's older brother drove us back to get my flashlight. It was still there in the middle of the road, still working, the beam pointing into the ditch. But what made my blood run cold were the tracks. Single footprints, each one about 16 inches long, pressed deep into the gravel. They started in the middle of the road where we'd seen it, went about 20 feet into the woods, and then just stopped. Like whatever made them had simply vanished. Over the next few years, we had a few more encounters in that area, but never again as clear or as close as that night. Sometimes we'd hear wood knocking in the distance, or catch glimpses of something large moving through the trees. Once we found a half-eaten deer carcass wedged high up in a tree fork, at least 12 feet off the ground. But that night in October, 76 was the last time we saw it clearly. Tommy moved away after high school, but I still live in the area. Old Miller's Road is paved all the way through now, and there are houses where we used to hunt for beer cans. Sometimes, though, on quiet fall nights when the moon is full, I can still feel that watching presence. The crickets will suddenly go silent, and for just a moment, I'm 15 years old again, standing frozen in terror as something impossible steps out of the shadows. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I convinced myself that maybe our parents were right, that we'd somehow imagined or exaggerated the whole thing. But I recently found my old journal from that time, with entries written just days after it happened. The details match exactly what I remember. The height, the stride length, the way it moved, everything. I didn't imagine it. Whatever we saw that night was real, and it's still out there somewhere. The logical part of my brain has spent decades trying to explain it away. Maybe it was someone in a costume, but how did they move like that? Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't walk on two legs that smoothly, and they definitely don't have those eyes. Maybe it was mass hysteria, but what about the tracks? I don't have any answers. All I know is what I saw, and that night changed how I view the world forever. You can skip this last part if you want, but I feel like I need to say it. If you're ever out in the woods of Virginia and everything suddenly goes quiet and you get that feeling of being watched, don't try to be brave. Don't try to get proof. Just leave. Because whatever that thing was, it let us run that night. I'm not sure everyone who encounters it is that lucky. I was 13 at the time, sitting in the back of our school bus as we headed home from an away game in the next county over. We'd lost pretty badly, and everyone was in a sour mood, especially Coach Mitchell. The bus was mostly quiet except for a few kids grumbling about bad calls from the refs. I was staring out the window, watching the countryside roll by in the darkness, trying to forget about how I'd missed what would have been the game-tying shot in the third quarter. It was around 9:30 p.m., and the moon was nearly full that night, casting an eerie glow over the frost-covered fields we were passing. We were somewhere in Brunswick County, on one of those long, straight country roads that seemed to go on forever. The heater in the old bus was barely working, and I remember having my jacket pulled tight around me, my breath fogging up the window. That's when I saw it. We were passing by this old cornfield. Most of it had been harvested, but there was still this lonely scarecrow standing there, probably forgotten after the harvest. The scarecrow was pretty tall, maybe 7 feet or so, and in the moonlight I could see it clearly. But what caught my eye wasn't the scarecrow. It was what was standing next to it. At first, I thought maybe it was another scarecrow, but then it moved. This thing was massive. Its head came up to about chest height on the scarecrow, which would put it at least 8 or 9 feet tall. The moonlight was hitting it just right, and I could see it was covered in dark, shaggy hair or fur. It wasn't like a bear standing up. I'd seen bears before at the zoo, and this was different. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. It was built more like a person, but impossibly big. I remember feeling my whole body go cold, and not from the barely working heater. The creature was standing about 75 to 100 yards from the road, just on the edge of the harvested cornfield. It seemed to be examining the scarecrow, almost like it was curious about it. As our bus passed by, it turned its head toward us, and I swear I could see its eyes reflect in the moonlight. Holy shit! I remember blurting out loud enough that several kids turned to look at me. Look! Look out there! I was pointing frantically at the window, but by then we'd already started to pass it. What's your problem, Thompson? Mike Stevens, one of the 8th graders, sneered from a few seats up. There's something out there. It's huge. We need to go back. I was practically jumping out of my seat, my heart racing. Coach! Coach Mitchell, please, we need to turn around. Coach Mitchell, who was already in a foul mood from our loss, turned around from the front of the bus. Sit down and be quiet, Thompson. I'm not in the mood for games tonight. But, Coach, I'm serious. It was like a giant person or something. It was next to that scarecrow back there. That got a few laughs from my teammates. Oh, sure. Maybe it was the jolly green giant coming to get you, someone called out, and more laughter followed. What's next? Gonna tell us you saw Bigfoot, Mike added, and that really got them going. But I knew what I'd seen. The creature had been massive, with long arms that hung down past its knees. Its shoulders must have been at least 4 feet wide, and even from that distance, I could tell it was powerfully built. The hair covering its body looked matted and thick, especially around the shoulders and head. What still haunts me is how it moved. So fluid and deliberate, nothing like a person in a costume would move. Coach Mitchell threatened to make us all run extra laps at practice if we didn't quiet down, so I shut up. But I kept staring out that window until the cornfield disappeared from view, hoping to catch another glimpse of it. My hands were shaking and I felt sick to my stomach. I knew nobody would believe me, but I also knew what I'd seen was real. The rest of the ride home was torture. Every shadow we passed made me jump, and I kept thinking about those eyes reflecting in the moonlight. The other kids kept making jokes, asking if I'd seen any UFOs or the Loch Ness Monster too, but I barely heard them. I was too busy replaying every detail of what I'd seen in my mind, trying to burn it into my memory because I knew this was something important. When I got home that night, I tried to tell my parents, but they just assumed I was making up stories to distract from the basketball game loss. My dad even made some comment about how I should focus more on my jump shot and less on my imagination. After a while, I just stopped trying to convince people. The next day at school was rough. Word had spread about my Bigfoot sighting, and I became the butt of every joke. Kids would make exaggerated stomping noises when I walked by in the hallway or leave crude drawings of monsters in my locker. After a few weeks, they finally moved on to other things, but I never forgot what I saw. I tried going back to that spot a few times over the years during daylight hours. The scarecrow was gone by spring, and the field was replanted with corn. I walked along the edge of the field, looking for any signs, broken stalks, unusual tracks, anything. But I never found anything conclusive. The farmer who owned the land said he'd never seen anything unusual, but he did mention that his dogs would sometimes get agitated at night for no apparent reason, especially during the winter months. What's strange is that, after that night, I started hearing other stories from around Brunswick County. Most people wouldn't talk about it openly, but if you got them alone and they trusted you enough, they'd tell you about things they'd seen in the woods or late at night. Missing livestock that couldn't be explained by normal predators. Strange sounds in the night that didn't match any known animal. Unusually large footprints found in muddy areas after rain. I'm 56 now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that night. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings, looked at photos and videos, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The creature I saw seemed more real, somehow. Less like the monster from the Patterson film and more like an actual living being that was just as surprised to see us as I was to see it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, or if there are more of them. The area has changed a lot since 1980. More houses, more roads, fewer wild spaces. But there are still plenty of remote areas in Brunswick County, places where something large could hide if it wanted to. I've never gone camping since that night, and I still get an uneasy feeling whenever I drive past cornfields after dark. Some people might say I'm letting one strange experience control too much of my life, but they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't see those eyes reflecting in the moonlight, or the way it moved with such unnatural grace for something so large. I'm not writing this to convince anyone or to prove anything. I know what I saw, and after all these years, that's enough for me. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the moon is full, I find myself looking out my window, wondering if somewhere out there, that creature is still examining scarecrows in forgotten cornfields, trying to make sense of the strange things we humans leave behind. The only reason I'm finally sharing it is because my grandmother passed away last year, and I don't feel like I need to protect her from what I saw anymore. This happened in Henry County, Virginia, in December 1982, when I was staying at my great-grandmother's farmhouse. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I woke up absolutely parched. The old farmhouse had those radiator heaters that would dry out the air something fierce, and I remember my throat feeling like sandpaper. I got up from the guest room bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak too much. Anyone who's been in an old Virginia farmhouse knows exactly what I mean about those floors. The kitchen was on the first floor, and my room was upstairs, so I had to make my way down that narrow staircase in the dark. I didn't want to wake anyone up by turning on lights, so I just used what little moonlight was coming through the windows to guide me. It was one of those clear, cold December nights where you could see pretty well once your eyes adjusted. I just finished getting my glass of water when something made me freeze. You know that feeling when the air around you just feels wrong? That's what hit me. I can't explain it any better than that. It was like all the normal nighttime sounds just stopped. No crickets, no nothing. Just dead silence. Our kitchen had this big window that looked out over the gravel road that ran past the house. The moon was bright enough that you could see pretty clearly across to the tree line on the other side. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was looking at. Maybe it was a shadow from one of the oak trees. But then it moved. This massive, dark figure just stepped out onto the road. The thing that still haunts me to this day was how it crossed that road. Our gravel road wasn't particularly wide, maybe 15 feet across, but this thing cleared it in a single stride. One step, just one. I remember being frozen there, water glass halfway to my mouth, just staring. It was huge, had to be at least 8 feet tall, but it wasn't just the height that was unsettling, its proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. The whole thing was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The moonlight caught it just right as it moved, and I could see the muscles shifting under all that hair. It wasn't some guy in a costume. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural, and there was this presence about it. You know how you can sense when something is intelligent? This thing knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing. I didn't move a muscle until it disappeared into the tree line on the other side. I must have stood there for another 10 minutes, just staring out that window, before I finally managed to make myself go back upstairs. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. The next morning, I came down for breakfast, and I knew something was off the moment I saw my great-grandmother's face. She was sitting at her kitchen table, clutching her coffee cup like it was keeping her anchored to reality. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "Something was outside my window last night," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Around 3 a.m., standing right there, looking in." My blood ran cold. Her bedroom was on the ground floor, on the other side of the house from where I'd seen the thing cross the road. She went on to describe hearing heavy breathing and something pressing against the side of the house. She said she was too scared to look directly at the window, but she could see a large shadow blocking out the moonlight. After breakfast, I went outside to look around. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. She was 82 years old, and I didn't want to frighten her more than she already was. But what I found made my skin crawl. There was a large patch of grass completely flattened on the side of the house near her window, like something massive had been standing there. And in one spot, where the ground was softer, there was a single footprint. I grew up hunting. I know what bear tracks look like. This wasn't that. The print was huge. I measured it with a ruler from my great-grandmother's sewing room. 18 inches long and about 8 inches wide. The impression was deep too, like whatever made it was incredibly heavy. The strangest part was how human-like it looked, but massively oversized and with features that just weren't quite right. The next few nights I hardly slept. I kept thinking I heard things outside, but every time I worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. The dogs in the area were acting strange too, either barking like crazy at nothing or being unnaturally quiet. After about a week, things started to go back to normal. The wildlife sounds returned, the dogs calmed down, and that heavy feeling in the air lifted. But I never forgot what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of mass hysteria. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But none of those explanations quite fit what I experienced. I've never gone public with this story before. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw that December night in 1982. That thing was real, it was intelligent, and it was nothing that should exist in our world. Sometimes, when I can't sleep at night, I still think about how it crossed that road in a single step, and I wonder if it's still out there in the Virginia woods, watching and waiting. What really gets to me, even after all these years, is how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't some animal randomly wandering through. It knew exactly what it was doing, checking the windows, moving with purpose. And the fact that my great-grandmother encountered it too, but from a completely different vantage point, well, that's what makes it impossible for me to dismiss it as just my imagination. I've been back to Henry County a few times since then, but I've never stayed overnight again. Some things you just don't tempt. I've heard other stories from that area over the years. Hunters finding strange prints, people hearing weird calls in the night, livestock acting spooked for no apparent reason. I don't know if they're related to what I saw, but I do know that something was out there that night. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. My great-grandmother lived in that house until she passed away in 1989, and she never mentioned that night again. I think we both silently agreed that some things are better left undiscussed. But every time I visited her after that, I noticed she'd installed extra outdoor lights, and she always made sure all the curtains were closed tight before sunset. The footprint we found that morning eventually washed away in the rain, and the flattened grass eventually sprang back up. But the memory of that thing crossing the road in one stride, its massive silhouette outlined against the moonlight, that stayed with me all these years, as clear as if it happened yesterday. I've never shared this story before, but what happened to me during that hunting trip in Amherst County back in '88 still haunts me to this day. I've been a hunter all my life. Started when I was just a kid with my dad in the Virginia woods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that October night. It was during the early bow season, October 15th, 1988 to be exact. I remember the date clearly because it was the first weekend I'd managed to get out that season due to work commitments. I'd set up my stand about 2 miles deep into the George Washington National Forest, in a spot I'd been hunting for years. The area was pretty remote. You had to hike in a good way off Fire Road 491, past the old logging trail that nobody used anymore. The weather that day had been unseasonably warm for October, around 65 degrees, but it had cooled off significantly after sunset. I'd been in my tree stand since about 4:30 that afternoon. It was a steel ladder stand, secured about 18 feet up in an old oak that gave me a good view of several game trails that converged in a small clearing below. I'd picked this spot carefully during scouting trips, noting lots of deer sign and some reliable patterns of movement. I was using my favorite hunting rifle, a Remington 30, 06 that I'd had for about 5 years at that point. Had my usual gear too, rangefinder, binoculars, flashlight, and a small pack with some water and snacks. The moon was supposed to be new that night, but I hadn't really thought much about it when I headed out. Looking back, maybe I should have. Everything was normal until about 7:45 p.m. It was completely dark by then, and I was getting ready to pack it in. Legal shooting hours were over, and while I hadn't seen any deer, it had been a peaceful evening in the woods. That's when everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. If you spend enough time in the woods, you know they're never really quiet. There's always something, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals. But suddenly, everything just stopped. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the forest. The hair on the back of my neck stood up immediately. In all my years of hunting, I'd never experienced anything quite like it. That's when I heard it. The sound started directly below my stand. Couldn't have been more than 15, 20 feet from the base of my tree. It began as this deep, guttural growl that made my chest vibrate. At first I thought maybe it was a black bear. We have plenty of those in the area. But this was different. It was deeper, more powerful than any bear I'd ever heard. It reminded me of those nature documentaries with lions, but bigger, more primal. But then it changed. The growl transformed into something I still have trouble describing. It was like a scream, but not human, not animal, nothing I'd ever heard before or since. It started low and rose in pitch until it was this piercing shriek that seemed to go right through me. The sound echoed through the darkness, bouncing off the ridges, lasting for what felt like forever, but was probably only 8, 10 seconds. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I've faced down angry bears, been stuck in tree stands during thunderstorms, but this was different. This was primal fear, the kind that goes straight to your lizard brain and tells you you're in the presence of something you don't understand. Here's the thing that really got to me, something that still bothers me when I think about it. The ground below my stand was covered in dry leaves. Anyone who hunts knows how impossible it is to move quietly through fall leaves. But whatever made that sound moved around beneath me without making a single crack or rustle. I could feel its presence moving, could sense it circling the base of my tree, but there wasn't a sound. Not one leaf crunch, not one twig snap, nothing. I had my flashlight with me, one of those big D-cell mag lights that were popular back then, but I couldn't bring myself to look down. Part of me didn't want to draw attention to myself, but if I'm being completely honest, I was too scared to see what might be down there. The darkness below me was absolute. No moon, no stars visible through the canopy, just pure blackness. The presence stayed below me for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15, 20 minutes. During that time, I heard 2 more of those screams, each one making me feel smaller and more vulnerable than the last. I had my rifle ready, but what good is a gun when you can't see what you're shooting at? And something in my gut told me that even with a 30-06, I might just make whatever was down there angry. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it left. I didn't hear it leave. Again, no sound in those dry leaves, but I felt the presence move away. It's hard to explain, but it was like a weight lifted, like the air itself became lighter. Gradually, the normal nighttime sounds of the forest returned. First a few crickets, then an owl, then everything was back to normal as if nothing had happened. I stayed in that tree for another 2 hours, couldn't bring myself to climb down any sooner. When I finally did, my legs were shaking so bad I could barely use the steps. I kept my flashlight beam moving constantly, scanning the darkness around me. The beam caught nothing but trees and leaves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walk out was the longest 2 miles of my life. I kept my rifle ready, and looked back so many times my neck was sore the next day. When I finally reached my truck, I sat there for a long time with the engine running and the lights on, trying to process what had happened. I went back the next day in full daylight to check the area. Found some broken branches high up, way higher than a bear could reach, and a few weird impressions in the ground that the leaves had already mostly covered. But nothing conclusive, nothing I could point to and say, this proves what I experienced. About 2 weeks later, I ran into Bill Matthews at the gas station. He hunts the same general area, different ridge, but maybe a mile from my spot. Without me saying anything about my experience, he started telling me about a weird night he'd had in his stand. As he described the sound he'd heard, my blood ran cold. It was the same thing, that same horrible scream. His hunting partner, Dave, had been about a quarter mile away and heard it too. I still hunt those woods, but never again at that particular spot, and never again after dark. I've been a rational person all my life, never put much stock in creature stories or local legends, but what happened that night changed something in me. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that defy explanation. I don't know what was under my stand that night, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't anything I'd encountered in over 30 years of hunting these woods. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that scream in my head, still feel that presence below me in the darkness, still remember the way it moved without sound through those dry leaves. I've never told this story to many people who'd believe it, but I know what I experienced, and I know somewhere out in those Virginia woods there's something that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. One thing's for certain, I never hunt alone after dark anymore, and if I'm in my stand and everything goes quiet, well, let's just say, I don't stick around to find out what might happen next. My girlfriend Sarah, not her real name, and I had planned this camping trip near an old fire tower for weeks. We both loved the outdoors, and being a biologist, I was always eager to observe wildlife in their natural habitat. The location was perfect, remote enough to feel like true wilderness, but still accessible by a decent hiking trail. The abandoned fire tower stood like a lonely sentinel above the tree line, a remnant of forest management practices from decades past. We arrived at the camping spot around 4 p.m. The August heat was intense, but the higher elevation provided some relief. We set up our tent about 200 yards from the tower's base, in a small clearing that gave us a decent view of the surrounding area. The forest there was typical Appalachian mixed hardwood, lots of oak, hickory and maple trees. What wasn't typical was what we'd encounter later that night. Around 8 p.m., we started hearing voices echoing through the trees. A group of Virginia Tech students had hiked up to the area, probably looking for a place to party away from campus security. They were maybe 150 yards from our campsite, making enough noise to chase away any wildlife in the vicinity. Sarah and I were a bit annoyed, but figured they'd eventually quiet down or leave. As dusk settled in, I was sitting by our small campfire, occasionally glancing at the students through the trees. Their flashlight beams were dancing around as they passed around what I assumed were beer cans. That's when I noticed something odd. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that sudden silence usually means something's up. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the typical shadows cast by our fire. But then I caught movement about 80 yards to our right, between us and the student group. Something large and dark was moving through the trees with surprising stealth for its size. My first thought was bear, but the way it moved was all wrong. I've studied black bears extensively, and this wasn't bear behavior. The figure was bipedal, probably around 6 or 5 inches tall, with dark brown hair covering its body. What really caught my attention was the way the hair on its left arm hung down, longer than what you'd see on any known wildlife in the area. The creature moved with purpose, staying low and using the trees for cover. It would stop periodically, raise its head, and seem to sniff the air. I could see its massive shoulders shifting as it moved, much more humanoid than ursine. It was focused on the student group, who were completely oblivious to its presence. Sarah was reading in the tent, and I didn't want to startle her or draw attention to us. I sat absolutely still, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The creature was now about 60 yards from the students, crouched behind some mountain laurel bushes. It would occasionally peer around the vegetation, clearly observing the group. That's when I made a mistake. I shifted position to get a better look, and my boot scraped against a rock. The sound wasn't loud, but in the unnatural silence of the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature's head snapped in my direction with frightening speed. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we made eye contact. Even in the growing darkness, I could see its eyes reflecting the distant firelight. They weren't the eyes of an animal. There was an intelligence there that sent chills down my spine. The creature remained perfectly still, assessing me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My scientific mind was racing, trying to categorize what I was seeing, but coming up empty. Then, without making a sound, it slowly stood to its full height. The movement was fluid, nothing like the jerky motions you see in those fake Bigfoot videos. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its head seemed to sit directly on them with little visible neck. The arms were proportionally longer than a human's, and I could clearly see powerful muscles shifting under the hair. The creature held my gaze for another moment, then turned and moved into the deeper forest. Its retreat was so quiet and controlled that if I hadn't been watching it, I would never have known it was there. The way it moved through thick underbrush without making a sound was incredible, like it knew exactly where to place each foot. As soon as it disappeared, the forest sounds gradually returned. The students were still partying, completely unaware of what had just happened. I sat there for probably another hour, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, but the creature never returned. The next morning, Sarah and I searched the area. We found some odd depressions in the soil that could have been footprints, but the ground was too dry and hard to show clear details. There was also a distinctive musky odor near the bushes where the creature had been watching the students, unlike anything I'd encountered before in my research. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. My scientific background demands evidence, explanation, categorization. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, wasn't any known species. The fluid movements, the intelligent eyes, the silent, stalking behavior. It all points to something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've never filed an official report. As a biologist, making claims about seeing Bigfoot isn't exactly career-enhancing. But I know what I saw that night in Giles County. I've been in those woods hundreds of times since then, studying various species, but I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes when I'm out doing field research, I'll get that feeling of being watched. and the forest will go quiet. When that happens, I pack up my gear and leave. Some questions in nature are better left unanswered. The students from that night probably still tell stories about their party by the old fire tower, never knowing how close they came to something. I don't know if it meant them harm. Its behavior seemed more curious than aggressive. But I do know that there are things in our forests that defy scientific explanation, and that night in 1990 proved it to me beyond any doubt. What bothers me most, even after all these years, isn't just what I saw, it's the implications. If such a creature exists in Virginia's forests, how has it remained hidden for so long? How many are there? What else don't we know about our own backyard? These questions haunt me more than the actual encounter. I still go camping, still do field research, but I never stay near that fire tower after dark anymore. Some experiences change you forever, make you question everything you thought you knew. That August night was one of them. I can still see those eyes when I close mine, still feel that moment of absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something unknown to science. It's humbling and terrifying all at once. I served as a military police officer at Davidson Army Airfield in Fairfax County, Virginia, back in '78. What I experienced during my time there still haunts me to this day, and I've spent decades trying to make sense of it. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or supernatural stuff. My job was about facts, evidence, and following protocol. But what happened that summer challenged everything I thought I knew about our world. I worked the night shift, which meant patrolling the perimeter of the airfield from 2000 to 0600. The base was surrounded by dense forest and swampland, particularly heavy on the southern fence line. It was usually quiet, just the occasional deer or raccoon setting off the motion sensors. But things started getting weird around early July. At first it was just subtle changes in the environment. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, frogs, owls, would suddenly stop. Complete silence. Anyone who's worked security knows that sudden silence is never a good sign. Then came the sounds of branches breaking, but not like when deer move through the brush. These were loud cracks, like something massive was moving through the trees. I remember the first really strange incident clearly. It was July 15th, around 0200. The air was thick with humidity, typical for Virginia summers. I was doing my regular perimeter check in the patrol vehicle, heading toward the south fence line. The swampy area there always had this distinct musty smell, but that night there was something different. This overwhelming stench like rotting meat mixed with wet dog. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I stopped the vehicle and grabbed my flashlight. Standard procedure was to investigate any unusual occurrences, though everything in my gut was telling me to keep driving. The beam of my maglite cut through the darkness, sweeping across the fence line and into the tree line beyond. That's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard from a bear or any other animal I knew. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt this overwhelming sensation of being watched. I swept the flashlight back and forth, trying to locate the source. Then I saw them. 2 red eyes reflecting in the darkness about 8 feet off the ground. Not the usual greenish reflection you get from deer or other wildlife. These were deep red, and they were fixed directly on me. I'd been trained to handle various threats, but nothing in my training covered anything like this. The eyes were too high up to be a person, unless they were on stilts in a swamp in the middle of the night, which made no sense. I reached for my radio to call it in, but before I could, there was a massive crash in the underbrush. Whatever it was moving away, and fast. The sound of breaking branches and disturbed vegetation lasted for several seconds, then faded into the distance. I immediately reported the incident, though I was careful about how I worded it. You don't last long in military service talking about mysterious creatures. I logged it as a possible security breach and unusual wildlife activity. But that was just the beginning. 2 nights later, around 0300, a civilian pulled up to the main gate in a panic. I was stationed there that night, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Pure terror. He was driving home from late shift work when, according to him, something huge and hairy stepped out onto Manor Road. right near the base entrance. He said he nearly hit it with his car, and when his headlights illuminated it, he saw a massive figure, easily 7, 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. The thing apparently turned and looked right at him before disappearing into the woods with incredible speed. I took his statement, trying to remain professional, while my mind raced back to those red eyes I'd seen. The civilian was shaking the entire time and kept saying, "That wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. Bears don't move like that." He was right. Bears don't typically walk on 2 legs for extended periods, and they certainly don't run into the woods upright. Over the next few weeks, other MPs and base personnel started reporting strange occurrences. Johnson, who patrolled the eastern perimeter, reported finding unusual tracks in a muddy area, huge footprints, 16, 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were deeper than any human print should be, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Matthews, working the gate, reported hearing wood-knocking sounds coming from the forest, like someone hitting trees with a baseball bat, but much louder. The incident that finally convinced me something truly unexplainable was happening occurred in early August. I was doing my usual patrol, this time on foot near the south fence. The night was unusually clear, with a full moon providing decent visibility. That strange smell had returned, that unmistakable combination of decay and musk that I'd come to associate with the weird occurrences. I heard movement in the brush about 50 yards ahead of me, just beyond the fence line. Training my flashlight on the area, I slowly approached. The beam caught something moving, something big. Through gaps in the foliage, I could make out dark hair, but what struck me was the way it moved. It wasn't the awkward waddle of a bear or the graceful movement of a deer. This thing moved with purpose, almost human-like, but far too large to be a person. Then it stood up. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over any height reference I could make out. Its shoulders were massive, probably twice the width of mine. The head appeared to sit directly on the shoulders with no distinct neck. But what I remember most clearly were those eyes again. That same deep red reflection I'd seen before, now fully visible and unmistakably looking right at me. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stood there, staring at each other. I could hear its breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that seemed to vibrate the air around me. The smell was overwhelming at this distance, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd experienced before or since. Then it made a sound that I still hear in my nightmares, a long, low vocalization that started as a deep growl and rose to something between a roar and a scream. It was so loud it seemed to shake the ground, and I heard birds exploding from the trees in panic. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I stood frozen, my training fighting against my fear. Suddenly it moved, not away from me this time, but toward the fence. I saw its full height as it approached, easily 8 feet tall, possibly more. Its movements were fluid, nothing like the awkward gait you'd expect from someone in a costume. Each step covered an impossible amount of ground. When it reached the fence, it simply reached up and grabbed the top with one massive hand. That's when my training finally kicked in. I drew my service weapon and fired a warning shot into the air. The creature immediately dropped back to all fours and bolted into the woods, moving with incredible speed for something so large. The sound of its retreat was like a freight train moving through the forest. Branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed, small trees actually being pushed aside. I immediately radioed for backup, and within minutes, other MPs arrived with vehicles and spotlights. We searched the area and found clear evidence of something large having moved through. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and most notably, those same massive footprints in several places where the ground was soft. We took photographs and measurements, but mysteriously, most of that evidence disappeared from the base's records in the following weeks. The strange occurrences continued sporadically for another month or so, then suddenly stopped. It was as if whatever had been in the area simply moved on. We never found any conclusive evidence of what it was, and over time, the official stance became that it was probably bears or other wildlife, despite the obvious inconsistencies with that explanation. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that night. I've looked into every possible explanation: bears, escaped exotic animals, even the possibility of some sort of military experiment. None of them fit what I witnessed. The size, the movement, those eyes, that sound. It was unlike anything known to exist. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. I was a skeptic myself before all this happened, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. Whatever was prowling around Davidson Army Airfield in the summer of '78 wasn't any known animal, and it certainly wasn't human. The experience changed my entire worldview, and to this day I can't drive past a densely wooded area at night without scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those red eyes staring back at me again. The military teaches you to trust your training, trust your instincts, and trust your eyes. That night, all three told me I was dealing with something that shouldn't exist. Maybe that's why most of the official documentation vanished. Some things are just too difficult for our structured, rational world to acknowledge. But I know what I saw, and I know I'm not alone. There are others out there who've had similar encounters, and slowly, we're starting to realize that maybe our world is a bit more mysterious than we'd like to admit. I've never told this story outside of my immediate family, but what I experienced that night in May 1970 has haunted me for over 50 years now. I was 15 at the time, camping with my family at John H. Kerr Reservoir in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. Even now, at 69 years old, I can recall every detail of that night with crystal clarity. It was May 16th, a warm Saturday night. We'd spent the day fishing and setting up our campsite in a secluded area near the reservoir. My dad, being an ex-Marine and detective sergeant, had everything organized with military precision, tents properly spaced, gear meticulously arranged, and our campfire carefully maintained. Mom had cooked up some fish we'd caught earlier, along with hot dogs and beans. My younger sister Sarah had already gone to bed in her tent, and my parents were getting ready to turn in as well. Around 10:30 p.m., I was sitting by the dying campfire, using the last bit of light to read a comic book I'd brought along. The night was surprisingly quiet. No crickets, no frogs from the reservoir, just an occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. That should have been my first warning sign, but at 15, I wasn't exactly tuned into nature's signals. Then I heard it, a distinct rustling sound coming from our campsite's designated trash area about 30 yards from where I sat. At first, I figured it was probably a raccoon. We'd been warned about securing our food and trash because of them. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy-duty metal ones that my dad insisted we all carry, and decided to check it out. Looking back, I probably should have woken my father, but I wanted to handle it myself. You know how teenage boys are, always trying to prove themselves. As I approached the trash area, the rustling got louder, more deliberate. It didn't sound like a raccoon anymore. The movements were too heavy, too purposeful. My heart started beating faster, but I kept moving forward, sweeping my flashlight beam back and forth across the ground. The smell hit me first, this overwhelming musty odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. It was so strong it made my eyes water. When I finally aimed my flashlight directly at the source of the noise, I froze. What I saw there, hunched over our trash can, wasn't anything I could have prepared for. The creature was small compared to what you typically hear in Bigfoot stories, maybe 4 feet tall, but its proportions were all wrong for any animal I knew. It was covered in thick, matted fur that had this strange coloring, a mix of reddish-brown and orange-yellow, almost like autumn leaves. Its arms were too long for its body, with hands that looked disturbingly human-like as they picked through our trash. The moment my flashlight beam hit it, the creature snapped its head toward me. That's when my blood truly ran cold. Its face was... I still struggle to describe it. It was almost like a cross between a human child and an ape, but wrong somehow. Its eyes caught the flashlight and reflected it back like a cat's, but they were larger, more forward-facing. What I remember most was its expression. There was intelligence there, recognition. It wasn't the mindless stare of a wild animal. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it made this sound, this high-pitched, guttural shriek that I've never heard any animal make before or since. It was like a scream and a growl combined, but with this almost human quality to it that made my skin crawl. That's when I lost it. I started screaming too, dropping my flashlight and backpedaling so fast I fell over my own feet. The creature bolted into the darkness, moving with this weird, loping gait. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, branches snapping under its weight. By this time, the whole campsite was awake. My dad came charging out of his tent with his service revolver, while my mum was trying to calm my hysterical sister. I was babbling, trying to explain what I'd seen. Dad, being who he was, immediately went into investigation mode. He made me tell the story 3 times, each time asking for more specific details, exact time, distance, size comparisons, movement patterns. He searched the area with his more powerful flashlight, and we found some things that made it harder to dismiss what I'd seen as just imagination. The trash can was knocked over, but not in a way that seemed random. The garbage was spread out almost methodically, like someone had been sorting through it. There were these weird 5-toed footprints in the soft earth nearby, too large for a kid but too small for an adult, with a shape that wasn't quite human. And that smell. It lingered in the area for hours afterward, this distinctive musty odor that none of us could identify. Dad took detailed notes and even tried to make plaster casts of the footprints, but the ground was too soft, and they kept crumbling. He took measurements and photographs the next morning, but in the daylight, everything seemed less convincing somehow. The footprints had been partially washed out by the morning dew, and the garbage could have been explained by any number of natural causes. We stayed at the campsite for 2 more days, but nothing else happened. No more sightings, no more strange sounds, just that lingering smell that would occasionally drift through our campsite on the breeze. My sister refused to sleep alone in her tent, and honestly, I didn't blame her. I barely slept at all those next 2 nights. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college and started reading about Bigfoot encounters, that my family began to speculate about what I might have seen. The height, the coloring, the almost human-like behavior. It all pointed to the possibility that what I encountered might have been a juvenile Bigfoot. The location made sense too. The reservoir area was remote enough, with plenty of forest cover and water access. My dad, despite his law enforcement background and natural skepticism, never dismissed what I saw. He kept those notes and would occasionally revisit them, especially whenever there were reports of strange sightings in the area. He passed away in 1992, and I found those notes in his personal effects, along with newspaper clippings about other unusual sightings around Mecklenburg County from the 70s and 80s. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw that night. I've considered every possible explanation: bears, escaped monkeys, even an elaborate prank. But none of them quite fit what I experienced. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, that terrible shriek. It was something else entirely. I've never gone camping at John H. Kerr Reservoir again. I've never really gone camping anywhere since then. Some experiences change you fundamentally, alter the way you see the world. That night in May 1970 was one of those experiences for me. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt in those moments. That primal fear, that recognition that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we want to believe. It never really leaves you. Sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering about that creature. Was it lost? Was it as scared of me as I was of it? Was it really a young Bigfoot? And if so, where were its parents? These questions have haunted me for over 5 decades now, and I suspect they always will. The older I get, the more I realize that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to remind us that we don't know nearly as much about this world as we think we do. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, probably around 2 p.m. Me, Tommy, and Steve had biked out to the battlefield like we'd done countless times before. We were in 9th grade, and playing war games in the historic battlefield was our usual weekend entertainment. The place was perfect for it. Lots of cover, old trenches, and enough space that we could spend hours there without running into any other visitors. We'd brought our backpacks filled with snacks, some toy soldiers we used as markers, and a collection of interesting rocks we'd been gathering to mark our territories in our makeshift war game. The weather was starting to cool down a bit from the summer heat, but it was still warm enough that we were in our t-shirts and jeans. The battlefield was particularly quiet that day. Usually, you'd hear birds, squirrels rustling in the trees, and the occasional car passing on the nearby road. But thinking back, I remember noticing how eerily silent it had gotten around mid-afternoon. At the time, I didn't think much of it. We were too caught up in our game. We'd been playing for a few hours when we realized we'd left some of our marker rocks near the small creek that runs through the eastern part of the battlefield. Tommy suggested we go back to get them, since they were his lucky rocks he'd brought from home. The creek area was about a quarter-mile from where we were, down a slight slope and through a patch of dense trees. As we approached the creek, Steve suddenly stopped his bike. "Do you guys smell that?" he whispered. At first I didn't notice anything, but then it hit me. This overwhelming stench that I can only describe as a mixture of rotting meat and wet dog. It was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when we saw it. At first we thought it was a black bear in the creek bed. It was hunched over, seemingly examining something in the water. But then it stood up, and I felt my entire body go cold. This thing was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its arms hung down past its knees, and it was covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost black in the afternoon shadows. But what really struck me was its face, or rather, the lack of one. The head was shaped almost like a cone, sloping back from where a face should have been. But in the shadows cast by the trees, I couldn't make out any distinct features. No eyes, no mouth, just this dark void where a face should be. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, it just stood there, water dripping from its fur. Then it turned its head, that featureless, terrifying head, directly toward us. I've never felt such primal fear in my life. My whole body was trembling, and I could hear Tommy's rapid breathing next to me. What happened next still haunts my dreams. This thing, this creature, suddenly moved. But it didn't move like any animal I've ever seen. It took off along the creek bed, running on 2 legs, but at a speed that seemed impossible. We were on bikes, and I know for a fact that none of us could have kept up with it even if we'd tried. The way it moved was almost fluid, like watching water flow downstream, but at the same time, it was powerful enough that you could hear the impact of each footstep. The sound it made while running. That's something I'll never forget. It wasn't just footsteps. There was this deep, rhythmic breathing that seemed to reverberate in my chest, and occasional snapping sounds as it broke through branches in its path. We stood there frozen for what felt like minutes, before Tommy finally broke the silence with a shaky, "What the hell was that?" None of us had an answer. Steve, always the brave one, suggested we go home and come back with reinforcements. We agreed and pedaled home faster than we ever had before. Within an hour, we'd rounded up 5 other kids from our neighborhood, armed ourselves with sticks and rocks. What were we thinking? And returned to the creek. The smell was still there, though fainter. We searched the area for nearly 2 hours. The only evidence we found were some rocks in the creek that had been turned over, rocks that were too heavy for any of us to move easily. The wet stones underneath showed they'd been recently disturbed. We also found what might have been footprints in a muddy patch near the creek, but they were distorted and unclear. They were big, though, much bigger than any of our feet, but the rain that started later that evening washed away any chance of showing them to anyone else. The weirdest part? Over the next few weeks, we heard about other strange sightings in the area. A couple who lived near the battlefield reported hearing unusual noises at night. A local hunter claimed he found some unusually large branches snapped high up in trees, but nothing ever came of it. No concrete evidence, no clear photos, nothing. We kept going back to the battlefield after that, teenagers with something to prove, I guess. But we never saw it again. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as it appeared. Sometimes, especially on quiet afternoons when I'm alone in the woods, I catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that rotting smell, and my heart starts racing all over again. I'm 57 now, and I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we saw that day. Could it have been a bear? A man in a suit? Some kind of mass hallucination? But deep down, I know what we saw was real. It was something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that's still out there, probably watching from the shadows of other forests, other battlefields. The three of us, Tommy, Steve and me, we don't talk about it much anymore. Tommy moved to California years ago, and Steve passed away in 2019. But every now and then, usually late at night, I'll get a call from Tommy, and all he has to say is, "Been thinking about that day," and I know exactly what he means. Some experiences change you forever, and that September afternoon in 1981 was one of them. I still can't explain what we saw. I don't think I ever will. But I know what I saw, what we all saw, was real. And sometimes, that's the scariest part of all, knowing that something like that exists in our world, just beyond the edge of what we understand, watching and waiting in the shadows of seemingly ordinary places, like an old Civil War battlefield in Virginia. I was 22 then, doing the midnight security patrol with Rex, our German shepherd. It was July 12th, 1957, around 0130 hours. The night was unusually quiet, one of those thick Virginia summer nights where the humidity makes everything feel heavy. The moon was nearly full, which helped visibility, but the woods still played tricks on your eyes at that hour. My patrol route took me along the western perimeter, near Lake Lunga. It was mostly woodland there, old growth forest that hadn't been cleared when they built the base. The trees were dense enough that you'd need a flashlight even during the day. At night, even with the moonlight, the shadows between the trees were pitch black. Rex and I had done this route hundreds of times. He was a solid dog, well-trained, never spooked by raccoons or deer. That's why his behavior that night caught my attention immediately. We were about halfway through the patrol when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears went forward and the fur along his spine stood straight up. I'd never seen him like that before. At first I thought maybe it was a bear. We'd had them on base occasionally, especially near the lake where they'd come to fish. But Rex's reaction was different. With bears, he'd growl and bark, standard guard dog stuff. This time, he was dead silent, rigid as a statue, staring into the darkness between the trees about 50 yards ahead. The air felt different too. You know that feeling when a thunderstorm is coming and the pressure changes? It was like that, but more intense. And there was this smell. At first it was faint, something like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves. But it got stronger, and I started to feel it in the back of my throat. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled before or since. I clicked my flashlight on, sweeping the beam where Rex was looking. Nothing at first, just trees, shadows, more trees. Then I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness. I adjusted the beam slightly left and there it was. My blood went cold. Standing between two massive oak trees was something. The beam caught its legs first, thick, powerful, covered in light brown hair. As I raised the light I could see it was massive, had to be at least 7 feet tall. The hair was a uniform light brown color, except around its face which was darker. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. But it was the eyes that got me. When my light hit them, they reflected back. Not the red you'd see from a deer or bear, but a weird yellowish green. And they were intelligent eyes. It was looking right at me, studying me just as much as I was studying it. I'd been trained not to freeze up in tense situations, but all that training went right out the window. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight steady. Rex was still frozen beside me, making this weird whining sound I'd never heard him make before. Following protocol, I should have called it in immediately, but my radio felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching us. It wasn't behaving like any animal I'd ever encountered. There was purpose in its stillness, like it was deciding what to do. Finally, training kicked in. "Rex, attack!" I commanded, but my voice came out shakier than I'd have liked. Rex, who'd never hesitated to follow an order before, just pressed himself against my leg, still making that weird whining sound. That's when I reached for my M1. The moment my hand touched the rifle, the creature's demeanor changed instantly. Before I could even bring the weapon up to my shoulder, it moved. And God, the way it moved. It wasn't like a person running, and it wasn't like an ape. In 2 or 3 massive strides, it covered about 30 yards, disappearing into the darker woods toward the lake. The sound of it moving through the forest was unlike anything I'd heard before, not just heavy footfalls, but this weird mix of bipedal running and what sounded like hands hitting the ground occasionally. Branches snapped like twigs as it went, even ones that would have taken significant force to break. I started to pursue. That was procedure, after all, investigate any unauthorized presence on base. But Rex wouldn't move. He was a combat-trained military dog, and he was terrified. That stopped me cold. If Rex wouldn't follow, I wasn't about to go alone. I radioed it in, trying to keep my voice steady. Possible intruder spotted near Lake Lunga, proceeding west. Large individual requesting backup. I couldn't bring myself to say what I'd really seen. I knew how that would sound. The response team arrived about 10 minutes later. By then, whatever I'd seen was long gone. We found tracks, though. Massive footprints in the soft ground near where it had been standing. They were human-like but huge, maybe 16 inches long, and deeply pressed into the soil. The stride length between prints was incredible, easily twice what a person could manage. But by the time we got someone out there to properly document them, a sudden summer storm had rolled in and washed most of them away. Just my luck. The other Marines gave me hell about it for weeks. "Johnson's drunk on patrol again," they'd say, or "Watch out for Johnson's monster." My commanding officer suggested I was probably just overtired and had seen a bear standing on its hind legs. But I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. The thing that stuck with me all these years wasn't just how it looked, it was how it made me feel. I've been in combat, faced down enemy soldiers, but I've never felt anything like the primal fear that washed over me that night. It was like every cell in my body was screaming that I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. Something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. The incident was officially logged as a possible trespasser, never investigated further. But they did make some changes after that night. They added more lights along that section of the perimeter and started running patrols in pairs. Never said why, officially, but I noticed the other Marines started avoiding that route after dark, especially when the weather was humid and still, like it had been that night. I've read about other sightings over the years, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Some people describe similar creatures with the same kind of intelligent eyes and impossible speed. But I've never told my story publicly. Military folks aren't supposed to see monsters, and I had a career to think about. But I'm retired now, and I still think about that night often. Rex never patrolled the same after that, always got skittish near that section of woods. They retired him early, said he'd lost his edge. I knew better. He'd seen something that night that his training hadn't prepared him for. Hell, nothing could have prepared either of us for what we encountered. I've been back to Quantico a few times over the years. That section of woods is still there, though the base has grown around it. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, or if others have seen it but stayed quiet, just like I did for so long. Whatever it was, it changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist. One thing I know for certain, I was stone cold sober that night, and what I saw was real. You can believe me or not, that's your choice. But after 65 years, I still remember every detail like it happened yesterday. Some things you just can't forget, no matter how hard you try. I've never really talked about this before, except with my brother and a few close friends. What we saw that day in Wise County, Virginia, back in April 1984, has stayed with me for the past 40 years, as clear as if it happened yesterday. I was 16 at the time, and my brother Tommy was 12. Even now, at 56, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. It was a chilly spring afternoon, probably around 4:30 p.m. Dad was driving us back from visiting our grandparents in Norton. The sun was still up, but it was that kind of late afternoon light that makes everything look a bit golden. We were on one of those winding mountain roads. I think it was Route 72, but honestly, all those back roads looked the same to me back then. The trees were just starting to get their leaves, so you could still see pretty deep into the woods on both sides of the road. Tommy and I were both in the back seat. He was behind Dad, and I was on the passenger side. I remember I was looking out the window, just watching the trees go by, probably bored out of my mind like any teenager on a family drive. Dad had the radio on low, playing some country music station that kept cutting in and out because of the mountains. That's when I saw it. We were coming around this gentle curve, and through the trees, maybe 20 or 30 yards from the road, there was this thing. I say thing because calling it an animal doesn't feel right, and calling it a person feels even more wrong. It was walking through the trees, moving parallel to the road, taking these huge, deliberate steps. The first thing that hit me was the size. I've done construction work most of my life, so I'm pretty good at estimating measurements. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, not just tall, but massive. Like a linebacker times 2, had to be 500 pounds, easy. But it wasn't fat. It was built. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms were too long, hanging down past where knees would be. The whole thing was covered in black hair, not dark brown, but pure black. It wasn't patchy or mangy like a sick bear. This was thick, uniform hair covering its entire body. The hair wasn't super long and shaggy either, more like a short coat, maybe 3-4 inches long. It moved in this fluid way that I've never seen anything else move. Each step was like purposeful, deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was putting its feet. I remember my whole body going cold. You know that feeling when your stomach drops and your skin gets all prickly? It was like that, but 100 times worse. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch. Then Tommy grabbed my arm, hard. I looked at him, and his face was white as a sheet. His eyes were huge, locked onto the same spot I'd been staring at. He saw it too. That moment when our eyes met, I'll never forget it. It was like this silent confirmation that we weren't crazy, that this was really happening. The whole thing probably lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. The creature took maybe 4 or 5 of those long strides while we could see it. It never turned to look at us, never changed its pace. Just kept walking with that same steady rhythm, disappearing behind trees and reappearing in the gaps. Finally, I found my voice. "Dad! Dad! Stop the car!" I remember my voice cracking. Dad just glanced in the rearview mirror and said something like, "What's wrong with you boys?" "There's something in the woods!" Tommy practically screamed it. But by then, we were already past that stretch of road, taking another curve, and it was gone. Dad, of course, didn't believe us. He thought we were just trying to mess with him or playing some kind of game. "Probably just a bear," he said, but I could tell he was saying it just to shut us up. The thing is, I've seen plenty of bears. We grew up in bear country. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. They don't move like that. They don't look like that. The rest of the ride home was weird. Tommy and I kept looking at each other, then looking back out the windows, hoping to see it again. But we didn't. Dad kept trying to joke about it, saying stuff like, maybe it was Bigfoot coming to dinner, but we couldn't even smile. We were still in shock. That night after Dad went to bed, Tommy snuck into my room. We sat there in the dark, whispering about what we'd seen, every little detail we could remember, the way it moved, the way the muscles in its back shifted under that black hair, how its head seemed to sit right on its shoulders without much of a neck. We promised each other we'd never forget it. The next day, I begged Dad to drive back to that spot. He wouldn't, said we were being ridiculous. Over the next few weeks, the whole thing just became a family joke. "Remember when the boys saw Bigfoot?" Dad would say at dinner parties, laughing. Eventually, Tommy and I stopped talking about it, even to each other. It was easier that way. But here's the thing that really gets me. About 15 years later, when Tommy was in his late 20s, we were having a beer on his back porch. Our kids were playing in the yard, and somehow the conversation drifted to that day. For the first time in years, we really talked about it. Tommy told me something he'd never mentioned before. He said that just before the creature disappeared behind the trees for good, he saw it reach up and grab a branch. Not to break it or anything, just moved it aside, almost gently, like you'd push aside a curtain. Such a human gesture, but coming from this impossible thing. I've read about the Patterson-Gimlin film since then, watched it countless times. What we saw that day looked exactly like that creature. Same build, same way of moving, same everything. Sometimes I wonder how many other people have seen something like this but never talked about it. How many other kids spotted something through a car window and got laughed off by their parents? I've been back to Wise County a few times over the years. That area's changed a lot. More houses, more cleared land. But there are still stretches of those roads that look exactly like they did that day in '84. Sometimes I drive them real slow, scanning the trees. I've never seen anything like that again. Part of me hopes I never do. But another part of me wishes I had a camera ready that day. Wishes I could prove to everyone what Tommy and I saw was real. I know how this story sounds. If someone told it to me, I'd probably think they were making it up or remembering wrong. But I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I felt. That bone-deep certainty that you're seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that changes everything you thought you knew about the world. Tommy feels the same way. We don't talk about it much anymore, but every once in a while, one of us will call the other and just say, "Been thinking about that day." We don't have to specify which day. We both know. I'm telling this story now because I don't know. Maybe because I'm getting older and I don't want this to just disappear when I'm gone. Maybe because with all the trail cameras and phones these days, someone else might capture proof of what we saw. All I know is that somewhere in those Virginia mountains, on a spring afternoon in 1984, my brother and I saw something that defied explanation. And no matter how many people laugh it off or try to explain it away, nothing will ever convince me otherwise. We were driving back to Baltimore from Virginia Beach around 10:30 p.m. It had been a long weekend visiting Janet's sister, and we were both tired but in good spirits. The night was warm and humid, typical August weather in Virginia. We had the windows cracked, despite the car's AC running, and the radio was playing softly. I remember it was a clear night, almost full moon. Route 17 wasn't heavily traveled back then, especially that late. We were somewhere in Middlesex County, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. The road was pretty straight there, which gave us good visibility with the high beams on. I was doing about 55, maybe 60 miles per hour, just trying to make good time home. That's when I first spotted something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer. We'd already seen a few that night, so I started slowing down. But as we got closer, it looked more like a large dog lying on the pavement. Janet saw it too, and suggested we should move it off the road so no one would hit it. I slowed down even more, but something felt off. There was this smell that started seeping in through the car vents and the cracked windows. It's hard to describe, like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't place. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Janet covered her nose with her shirt. As we got within about 50 feet, I turned the high beams back on for a better look. That's when I noticed movement at the tree line to our right. At first glance, I thought it was an elderly black man crouching or hunched over at the edge of the woods. I remember thinking it was strange for someone to be out there at that hour, especially in such a remote stretch. But then it moved. God, I'll never forget how it moved. This thing covered the distance from the tree line to the middle of the road in 3 massive strides. 3, a distance that would have taken me at least 15, 20 steps. It stayed in that crouched position, hands hanging below its knees. That's when I realized what I'd thought were dreadlocks, or maybe a hat, were actually long, pointed ears covered in dark hair. The headlights illuminated it clearly. It was massive, even hunched over. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. The body was covered in dark, matted hair, but the face was different. The hair was shorter there, and the skin underneath looked almost grayish. The eyes caught the headlights and reflected back a dull reddish-orange, like a cat's eyes, but larger and set deep under a heavy brow ridge. Janet started screaming. I hadn't even realized I'd brought the car to a complete stop about 30 feet from this thing. My hands were locked on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Every instinct was screaming at me to reverse, to get out of there, but my body wouldn't respond. The creature was just watching us. Its head moved slightly, almost like it was studying the car. The dead dog I'd seen earlier was gone. Either it had moved it, or maybe there never was a dog. I don't know. What I do remember is the smell getting even stronger, so bad I could taste it in the back of my throat. Then we heard another car approaching from behind us. The headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, and that seemed to break whatever spell had frozen me in place. Before the other car got close enough to see what was happening, the creature turned and moved back toward the forest. Just like before, it covered the distance in these impossible strides, 2.5 steps, and it was gone into the darkness between the trees. The approaching car passed us, the driver probably wondering why we were stopped in the middle of the road. I hit the gas as soon as it was past, not even caring about speed limits anymore. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. Janet was crying quietly beside me. Neither of us spoke for at least an hour. We never saw any other cars stopped on that stretch. Never heard about anyone else encountering anything similar. I've looked up that area since then, found some old reports of strange sightings dating back to the 1950s, but nothing quite like what we saw. The thing that still haunts me, what I keep coming back to after all these years, was how deliberate its movements were. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. The way it watched us, the way it waited, there was intelligence there. And those eyes, they weren't just reflecting our headlights. There was awareness in them. Recognition, maybe. I've driven Route 17 many times since then, but never again at night. Janet refuses to take that road at all anymore. We told a few friends right after it happened, but their reactions convinced us to keep it to ourselves. Who'd believe us? A giant, hair-covered creature with pointed ears, crouching by the side of the road in Virginia? Sometimes I wonder about that other car, the one that passed us. Did they see anything in their rearview mirror? Did they notice the smell? Or were we the only ones who experienced whatever that was? I've spent years trying to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe some kind of large man playing a prank. But I know better. Whatever we saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either. I still get nervous driving rural roads at night. That smell occasionally comes back to me in dreams, that distinctive, horrific odor that seemed to precede and follow the creature. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I get this feeling, this certainty that I'm being watched, that something is observing me from just beyond the tree line, crouching, waiting, something that remembers me just as clearly as I remember it. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, some days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw. What Janet and I experienced that night was real. And the worst part? I'm convinced it's still out there, somewhere in those Virginia woods, watching and waiting for someone else to drive by late at night. Someone else to stop for what looks like a dead dog in the road. One last thing. I've read other people's accounts of similar encounters over the years. Some describe Bigfoot as this gentle, curious creature. Others paint it as aggressive and territorial. What we saw that night wasn't either of those things. It was calculating, patient, almost predatory, like it had done this before and would do it again. That's what scares me the most, the thought that this might be a regular hunting technique for these creatures. How many other drivers have stopped for what they thought was roadkill, only to come face to face with something impossible? I'm sharing this now because I'm getting older, and I want there to be a record of what happened. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe someone else has stopped on Route 17 late at night and caught that same terrible smell. If you have, you know I'm telling the truth. And if you haven't, well, just be careful on those dark country roads. And whatever you do, don't stop for roadkill at night. It might not be what it seems. It was March 15th, 2022. We'd been tracking a group of mule deer in Jackson County for a photo series we were working on. The weather that day was typical for early spring in Oregon, overcast around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light drizzle that had been on and off since morning. We'd found a promising spot about 17 miles from the nearest town, in a fairly remote area where we'd been getting some great shots of the local deer population. Everything was normal until about 6:45 p.m. The sun was setting, and we were reviewing our day's photos in our Subaru Outback. We had the windows cracked despite the chill because we were watching a small group of deer about 60 yards out. That's when I first noticed the smell. If you've ever been around a dead animal that's been sitting in the sun for a few days, it was kind of like that, but mixed with this really strong musky odor. Sarah noticed it too and actually reached to roll up her window, thinking maybe we were parked near something dead. Then we heard it. At first, we thought it was someone chopping wood, which made no sense given the time and location. It was this rhythmic knocking sound, like something hard hitting against tree trunks. We've been in these woods hundreds of times, and I've never heard anything quite like it. It wasn't random like branches falling. It had a pattern to it. Knock, 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 knock. Sarah was the first to spot it. She grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. About 40 yards from our car, this massive dark figure was moving between the trees. The light was pretty poor by then, but what struck me immediately was how smoothly it moved for something so big. When I say big, I mean big. We're both experienced outdoors people, and I'm 6'2". This thing had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. What happened next is something I'll never forget. The figure was carrying something. At first I thought it was a log or something, but as it moved, we could see it was a young deer. It wasn't dragging it. It was carrying it like you'd carry a grocery bag. Just effortlessly. I remember my hands shaking as I reached for the dashboard. I flipped on the high beams, and for a split second, everything was illuminated. The figure didn't run. Instead, it sort of crouched down behind this massive Douglas fir. But here's the thing. It was so tall that even crouching, we could still see its upper body and head. The fur was this dark brown-black color, matted in some places from the rain. Sarah had the presence of mind to grab her phone. She managed to get about 8 seconds of video, but it's pretty shaky. I've watched it probably 100 times since then. You can definitely see something large moving, but it's not National Geographic quality by any means. The whole time, there was this overwhelming feeling of being watched, not just observed, but studied. After about 30 seconds that felt like hours, it just moved away. I don't mean it ran. It just seemed to melt into the vegetation. The crazy thing is how quietly it moved for something that size. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. The woods went dead silent. No birds, no small animals, nothing. Just that lingering smell. We sat there for probably another hour, engines running, too terrified to move. I've never felt anything like that primal fear. It's like every cell in your body is screaming at you that you're in the presence of a predator. My hands were sweating so much I could barely grip the steering wheel. When we finally worked up the courage to leave, I almost crashed the car twice on the way out because I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. We drove straight home, didn't stop for anything. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we went back. I know it sounds crazy, but we had to know. We're photographers. Documentation is what we do. The area looked different in daylight, but what we found made my blood run cold. There were branches broken off at about 8 feet high, clean breaks, not weather damage. In a muddy patch near where we'd seen the figure, we found footprints. They were partial prints, not complete, but they were huge. I put my size 12 boot next to one for scale, and it was significantly larger. We took photos of everything, but honestly, they don't do justice to what we experienced. The footprints look flat in the photos, and the broken branches could be explained away if someone really wanted to, but being there, seeing how thick those branches were, knowing how high up they were broken, it was different. I've spent hundreds of hours trying to rationalize what we saw. I've looked up every large animal native to Oregon. I've watched countless nature documentaries. Nothing explains what we encountered. The way it moved, the intelligence in its actions, the deliberate way it tried to conceal itself. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. The video is still on Sarah's phone. We've shown it to a few trusted friends, but it's not the kind of thing you broadcast widely. When you see something like this, you quickly understand why most people keep these encounters to themselves. The few times we've tried to tell the story, we get the same reactions. People either think we're crazy or they try to explain it away. The weirdest part, we've been back to that area many times since then for work. Never saw anything like that again. No weird sounds, no strange smells, nothing. It's like it never happened. But sometimes, when we're out shooting at dusk, we'll catch a whiff of that same musty smell, or hear a branch crack in the distance, and we'll just look at each other and know we're not alone out there. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what we saw. I know what we experienced. And I know that there are things in our forests that we can't explain, no matter how hard we try. The deer population in that area has remained stable, by the way. We've continued our photography work there, though we never stay past sunset anymore. Sometimes I wonder if what we saw was a one-time thing, or if it's always there, just better at staying hidden than we are at finding it. Either way, it changed how we view the wilderness. It's still beautiful, still inspiring, but now we know. It's also holding secrets that maybe we're not meant to understand. I've been a park ranger in Humboldt County for over 15 years, and what happened last September still keeps me up at night. I've spent countless nights in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that night. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has seen something similar. It was September 14th, 2023, around 11:15 p.m. I was doing my usual night patrol in the more remote areas of the park in my 2018 Jeep Wrangler. Duke, my German Shepherd service dog, was with me as always. He's been my partner for the last 4 years and has never shown fear of anything. Bears, mountain lions, nothing. That's part of what makes this whole thing even more unsettling. The weather was unusually clear for September in Humboldt, with a nearly full moon. Temperature was around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was just a slight breeze. I was about 14 miles from the nearest ranger station, on one of those old logging roads that most tourists never see. I know every inch of these roads, every turn, every dip. You have to when you're patrolling at night. The first sign something was wrong was when my Jeep started making this weird clicking sound from the engine. I've had minor issues before, but this was different. Within minutes, the engine just died completely. I tried to restart it multiple times, but nothing. Just that awful clicking sound when I turned the key. I called for a tow truck using my radio cell service is practically non-existent out there. They said it would be about 2 hours before they could reach me due to my location. I wasn't too worried at first. Like I said, I've spent countless nights in these woods. I had my flashlight, my service weapon, and my night vision equipment. Plus, Duke was with me. We were parked near mile marker 23 on Forest Service Road 305, about 3 miles from the old Wilson Creek Bridge. That's when things started getting weird. Around 11:45 p.m., I heard it, a distinct sound of wood striking wood, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree. But it wasn't just from one direction. There were 2 separate sounds, almost like they were answering each other. One came from the dense forest to my left, maybe 150 yards away, and the other from somewhere behind my vehicle, probably further, around 200 yards if I had to guess. I've heard all sorts of sounds in these woods over the years. Animals, weather, even illegal campers. But this was different. It had a rhythm to it. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause. Then the other location would answer with the same pattern. This went on for about 10 minutes. Duke noticed it too. He was sitting up, ears forward, but he wasn't barking or growling. He was just listening. That's when I noticed how quiet everything else had gotten. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows that when everything goes quiet, something's up. I decided to use my night vision equipment to scan the area. The moon was bright enough that I probably could have used just my flashlight, but something told me to keep the area dark. I'm glad I did. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the typical forest scenery in that green, ghostly night vision view. But then, at around midnight, I saw movement on the road ahead of me, about 60 yards out. Something was crossing the road. I've seen every animal in these woods. Bears, elk, mountain lions, you name it. This wasn't any of those. This thing was walking upright, and it was huge. I'm good at estimating heights and distances. It's part of my job. This figure had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its head nearly reached the lower branches of the younger trees along the roadside. But it wasn't just the height that was off. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms were way too long, hanging down almost to its knees, and the way it moved. I've seen people in ghillie suits, hunters trying to be sneaky. This wasn't that. The movement was too fluid, too natural. It moved like it belonged there, like it knew these woods better than I did. The thing that really gets me, though, is what happened next. It stopped right in the middle of the road, just stopped dead still. Then it turned its head, just its head, and looked directly at my vehicle. I know it saw me. I know because of what it did next. It made this sound. I've tried to describe it to myself 100 times since then. It wasn't a roar like a bear or a scream like a mountain lion. It was deeper, more guttural. You didn't just hear it, you felt it in your chest. It was like a deep bass rumble mixed with something almost like speech, but not quite. The sound lasted for maybe 5, 6 seconds. That's when Duke lost it. I've never seen him like that before or since. He immediately dove under the Jeep. This is a trained service dog who's faced down aggressive wildlife without flinching, and he was trying to make himself as small as possible under my vehicle. He was shaking so bad I could hear his tags jingling. The figure stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Then it turned, not like a person turns, but in this weird, fluid motion, and walked into the forest on the other side of the road. Its stride was huge, covering ground in a way that seemed impossible. It disappeared into the trees, but I could hear brush moving for several minutes afterward, getting further away. The wood-knocking sounds had stopped by this point, but the forest stayed quiet. No normal nighttime sounds resumed. Duke refused to come out from under the Jeep. I kept scanning with my night vision, but I didn't see the figure again. The tow truck finally arrived at about 1:30 a.m. The driver, Mike, he's been working these roads almost as long as I have, noticed something was off as soon as he pulled up. He said the air felt heavy, which was exactly how I would describe it. While he was hooking up my Jeep, we found something that made my blood run cold. There were 3 young trees along the road, all about 4, 5 inches in diameter, that had been bent into perfect arches. Not broken, not pushed over bent, with their tops pointing toward the road. They formed an almost perfect line, about 20 feet apart from each other. Mike's been out here as long as I have, and neither of us had ever seen anything like it. These weren't beaver damage or storm damage. Something had deliberately bent these trees, and recently, there weren't even any dead leaves on them yet. I've reported what I saw to my supervisors, but I kept some details out of the official report. Who's going to believe a story about wood knocking and bent trees? I did go back the next day to document the trees, but they were already straightening back up. By the end of the week, you could barely tell they had been bent at all. I've been back on that road many times since then. It's part of my patrol route. I haven't seen anything like that again, but sometimes, especially on clear nights, I'll hear those wood knocks in the distance. Duke still gets anxious whenever we're in that area. He's fine everywhere else in the park, but when we get near mile marker 23, he gets restless and whiny. The thing that really sticks with me isn't just what I saw. It's the feeling I had, still have, that what I witnessed was something going about its normal routine. I wasn't meant to be there. I wasn't meant to see it. It was just passing through its territory, using those knocks to communicate with others of its kind when it stumbled across me broken down on that road. I've tried to rationalize it. Trust me, I've tried. But I know what I saw. I know that whatever it was intelligent enough to communicate, strong enough to bend trees, and definitely not something that's supposed to exist in these woods. Yet there it was. The engine problem turned out to be a failed alternator, by the way, something that should never have happened to a well-maintained vehicle. Sometimes I wonder if maybe it wasn't just random bad luck that caused my Jeep to break down exactly there, exactly then. I still do my patrols. I still love these woods, but now I know that something else is out there, something that knows these forests better than any of us ever will. And sometimes on quiet nights, I can still feel that deep, guttural sound resonating in my chest. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened at my property in Lewis County this January has been eating away at me. I need to get this off my chest, even though I know how it might sound. I'm a retired Marine, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I've always prided myself on staying level-headed. But what I witnessed that night, it's challenged everything I thought I knew. My wife and I moved to this property about 3 years ago. It's pretty remote, about 15 miles outside of Morton, Washington. We've got about 12 acres, mostly wooded, backing up against state forest land. We keep chickens, nothing major, just a small flock of 15 hens and a rooster. Never had any real problems with predators before this January. Maybe the occasional raccoon or coyote, but nothing we couldn't handle. It started on January 8th. I went out to check on the chickens in the morning like I always do. and something felt off. The chickens were agitated, which was unusual because they're typically pretty calm birds. As I got closer to the coop, I noticed some of the chicken wire was bent outward near the top, about 7 feet up. Now I'm 6'1", and I had to stretch to really examine it. Whatever did this had to be tall, but what really got me were the tracks in the snow. We'd had about 4 inches of fresh powder the night before, and there were these massive footprints leading from the forest line to the coop. I've tracked all kinds of wildlife before, but they were like nothing I'd ever seen. Each print was easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length was massive, probably around 5 feet apart. No bear walks like that. I took some photos and measurements, then reinforced the coop with extra wire. My wife thought it might be some teenagers messing around, but I wasn't convinced. Those tracks were too consistent, too natural in their placement to be fake. The next night, whatever it was, came back. This time, it managed to reach through the reinforced wire and actually grabbed one of our hens. The weird thing was how surgical it was. No major damage to the coop, just precise bending of the wire and one missing chicken. The tracks were identical to the previous night. By the third night, I was ready. I've got some gear left over from my service days, including a Gen 3 night vision monocular. I set up 4 trail cameras around the coop, good ones with motion sensors. I also installed 2 floodlights with motion detectors. I wasn't taking any chances. I started my watch around 10 p.m. from our back porch. The temperature was hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no wind, which made the silence almost overwhelming. I remember checking my watch at 1:47 a.m. when I first noticed something was wrong. The woods had gone completely quiet. No owls, no rustling, nothing. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows that's not natural. That's when I got this overwhelming sensation of being watched. It's hard to describe, but it was like this primal pressure at the base of my skull. Every instinct was screaming that something was out there, studying me. At 2:13 a.m., I remember checking my watch. I caught movement at the tree line, about 80 yards out. Through the night vision, I could see something massive moving between the trees. The way it moved, that's what really got to me. It was fluid, deliberate. This thing knew exactly where the cameras were. It stayed just outside their range, using the trees for cover. In all my years of military service, I've never seen anything move with such awareness while still being that size. Then it happened. This thing, and I'm still struggling to process what I saw, it emerged partially from behind a large Douglas fir. The motion sensors caught it, and the floodlights snapped on. For maybe 3 seconds, I had a clear view, and I'll never forget what I saw. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The body was proportioned like a human, but much more robust. The shoulders had to be at least 4 feet wide. The head sat directly on the shoulders, no visible neck. But it was the face that haunts me. It wasn't aggressive or animal-like. It looked intelligent. The eyes caught the light and reflected back with this reddish-orange glow. But there was awareness there, real cognitive awareness. The fur was dark, almost black, but had this brownish tint where the light hit it. It wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect. It looked almost groomed. The muscle structure was unlike anything I've ever seen. Even through the fur you could see how powerful this thing was. When the lights came on, it didn't run. That's what keeps playing in my mind. It slowly turned its head to look directly at me on the porch, and I swear to God it nodded, just slightly, but it was deliberate. Then it simply stepped back into the shadows, moving with this incredible silence despite its size. No crashed branches, no heavy footfalls, just smooth, deliberate movement. I sat there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The silence was deafening. Then, from deep in the woods, I heard what I can only describe as a call. Not quite a howl, not quite a whoop, but something in between. It was answered by another call from much further away, maybe miles. When I finally worked up the courage to check the coop, nothing was disturbed. The chickens were absolutely silent, huddled in the back corner. I checked the cameras the next morning. Nothing. Whatever this thing was, it knew exactly where to move to avoid detection. The strangest part? We haven't had a single issue since that night. No more bent wire, no more footprints, no more missing chickens. It's like it just wanted me to know it was there, that it could take what it wanted if it chose to, but was choosing not to. I've spent my entire adult life in situations where I needed to trust my instincts and observation skills. I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, wasn't any known predator. The intelligence it displayed, the deliberate nature of its actions, the way it acknowledged me, this was something else entirely. I've installed more cameras since then, reinforced the coop even more, but part of me knows that's pointless. If this thing wants to come back, no amount of chicken wire or trail cams is going to stop it. The weirdest thing is, I don't feel threatened by it anymore. There's this strange sense of respect, I guess. Like we've come to some kind of understanding. The experience has changed me. I still go out every morning to check on the chickens, but now I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of it. Sometimes, especially on quiet nights, I'll sit on the porch with my night vision gear, just watching. I haven't seen it again, but sometimes, when the woods go completely silent, I know it's out there, watching, waiting. For what? I don't know. I've told a few close friends about this, but most people just laugh it off or try to explain it away. I get it. I probably would have done the same thing before this happened, but I know what I saw. I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times, and every detail remains crystal clear. This wasn't a case of shadows playing tricks, or my mind making connections that weren't there. This was real, and it was intelligent, and it was aware of me just as much as I was aware of it. I've since learned that there have been other sightings in Lewis County over the years, though most people keep quiet about them. A few of my neighbors have hinted at similar experiences, though they're reluctant to talk about details. I understand their hesitation now. Some things sound too impossible to be true until you see them with your own eyes. I've been a commercial crabber out of Port Angeles for over 15 years now, but what happened last July completely changed how I view the waters and forests of the Olympic Peninsula. I'm still trying to make sense of it, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. I've gone back and forth about sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. It was July 12th, 2023, around 4:30 a.m. My buddy Mike and I were out checking our crab pots like we do several times a week during season. We had about 200 pots to check that morning, scattered across the coastline near Salt Creek Recreation Area. The weather was unusually calm for that time of year. Barely any wind, with a light mist hanging over the water. The kind of morning where sound carries for miles. We'd been out since 3 a.m., working our way west along the coastline. The tide was low, perfect for what we needed to do. We had our night vision gear with us, standard equipment for early morning work. Nothing seemed out of ordinary at first. We'd pulled up about 40 pots, and the catch was decent, just another normal morning on the water. Around 4:45 a.m., we were approaching a more secluded stretch of beach, about half a mile west of Tongue Point. The area's pretty remote, steep cliffs behind the beach, dense forest coming right down to the water. No houses or roads nearby. We were about 100 yards offshore when Mike noticed something on the beach. "Hey, check that out," he said, pointing toward the shoreline. "Think we got a bear down there?" I grabbed my binoculars and looked where he was pointing. In the pre-dawn darkness, I could make out a large figure standing near the water's edge. At first, I thought Mike was right. It looked like a bear standing on its hind legs, but something felt off about it. The proportions weren't quite right. We cut the engine to drift closer, not wanting to spook what we thought was a bear. That's when things got weird. This bear walked into the shallow water with a smoothness that no bear I've ever seen possesses. Its movements were deliberate, almost human-like. I switched to my night vision binoculars for a better look, and what I saw made my blood run cold. This thing was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had a broad, muscular frame covered in dark hair, but it wasn't a bear, not even close. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, but they moved with incredible precision. I watched as it reached down into the water and began methodically collecting something. Crabs, I realized. It was hunting in the shallows, picking up crabs and what looked like mussels with the dexterity of a person. The creature worked with a purpose that shocked me. It knew exactly what it was doing, moving along the shoreline systematically, like it had done this hundreds of times before. The way it examined each catch before either keeping it or putting it back reminded me of how we sort through our own crab pots. Mike and I didn't say a word to each other. We just watched, frozen in disbelief. The night vision gave everything a greenish tinge, but I could clearly see its massive head. It had a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a sagittal crest, kind of like a male gorilla. But this was no gorilla. Its face had a more human-like quality that made my skin crawl. We must have drifted for about 5 minutes, watching this thing work the shoreline. Then our old Johnson outboard, which had been idling roughly, suddenly coughed and sputtered louder than usual. The sound echoed across the water like a gunshot in the still morning air. The creature's head snapped up immediately, looking directly at our boat. I'll never forget that moment. Even through the night vision, I could tell it was staring right at us. There was an intelligence in that look that terrified me. It wasn't the startled reaction of a wild animal. It was the calculated response of something that knew exactly what we were and didn't want to be seen. It moved with incredible speed for something so large. In 2 massive strides, it was out of the water. That's when I really got a sense of its size. Its legs were thick as tree trunks, and it covered ground faster than any human could. It disappeared into the tree line within seconds, but not before I saw it clearly silhouetted against the lighter sand of the beach. Mike finally broke the silence. "Tell me you saw that too," he whispered, like he was afraid the thing might hear him, even though it was gone. We sat there for a few minutes, neither of us sure what to do. Finally, I fired up the engine, and we moved closer to shore. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was enough light now to see without the night vision. We could see its tracks in the wet sand. Huge footprints, easily 16 inches long with 5 distinct toes. They led from the water's edge straight into the forest. The stride length was massive, easily twice what a normal person's would be. What really struck me was how deep the prints were. I've been around plenty of big guys, 300-plus-pound fishermen, and their prints never sink into wet sand like these did. Whatever this thing was, it had to weigh at least 500 pounds, probably more. We found something else too. There were scattered crab shells and mussel shells near where it had been standing. They weren't crushed like a bear would do. They were cleanly picked apart, almost like how a person would eat them. Some of the crabs were Dungeness, the same ones we were out there to catch. The sun started coming up as we examined the scene. In the growing light, the whole thing felt surreal. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, hadn't watched it through my night vision binoculars, I wouldn't have believed it. But the footprints were there, massive and undeniable in the sand. We finished our route that morning, but we were both on edge. Every shadow in the trees along the shoreline seemed to hide something watching us. The familiar coastline that I'd worked for years suddenly felt alien and threatening. I've been back to that spot dozens of times since then. It's part of our regular route. Sometimes I think I catch whiffs of a strange, musky odor near that stretch of beach. Twice now, I've found similar shell middens, piles of cleaned crab shells and mussel shells arranged in a way that no animal would leave them. But I've never seen the creature again. The incident changed how I view these waters and the surrounding forest. I've spent countless hours on this coastline, thought I knew every inch of it. Now I realize there are things out here we don't understand. The locals, especially the tribal folks, have stories about things in these forests. I used to dismiss them as legends, not anymore. I still fish these waters. It's my livelihood. But I don't do early morning runs past that stretch of beach anymore. And when I'm out before dawn, I keep my night vision binoculars close, though honestly, I'm not sure I want to see that thing again. Mike and I don't talk about it much. What would be the point? Who would believe us? We're just 2 crabbers who saw something impossible in the pre-dawn darkness. But sometimes, when we're out on the water and the mist rolls in thick from the forest, I catch him staring at that stretch of coastline. I know he's thinking about it too. That massive figure, methodically hunting in the shallows, moving with an intelligence that still haunts me. The official reports say there are no apes in the Olympic Peninsula, no bears that walk upright for extended periods or possess that kind of dexterity. But I know what I saw that morning. Those footprints in the sand weren't from any animal I've ever encountered in my 15 years on these waters. Whatever it was smart enough to stay hidden all this time, smart enough to gather food in the dark when few people are around. smart enough to know exactly when to disappear. I've thought about reporting it officially, but I value my reputation in the fishing community too much. Still, I catch myself scanning the shoreline every morning now, especially around that spot. Part of me hopes to see it again, to confirm that I'm not crazy. A bigger part of me hopes I never do. Some things in this world aren't meant to be understood, and maybe that's okay. All I know is that somewhere in the dense forests of Clallam County, there's something that hunts the shoreline in the pre-dawn darkness. Something that knows these waters almost as well as we do. And sometimes, on very quiet mornings, when the mist hangs low over the water, I swear I can hear the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the shallows, just beyond the reach of our spotlights. It was October 12th, 2023. Me, Dan and Mike had set up our camp deep in the Trinity Alps wilderness, about 8 miles from the nearest access road. We'd been tracking a promising buck all day and were heading back to camp as the sun was starting to set. The temperature was dropping fast, typical for that time of year, and there was this heavy mist starting to roll in through the trees. I remember checking my watch at 6:47 p.m., thinking we'd have just enough light left to get dinner started. The first sign that something was wrong was the dead silence. Anyone who hunts knows that forests have a natural rhythm: birds, insects, small animals. But as we got within about 200 yards of our campsite, everything just stopped. Mike noticed it first and gave us this look that still gives me chills when I think about it. We'd been hunting together long enough to read each other's signals, and something was definitely off. When we reached our camp, my stomach dropped. Our entire setup was destroyed. I mean, absolutely ransacked. Our 3-man tent was ripped apart, poles snapped like twigs. Our supplies, dehydrated food packets, cooking gear, extra clothes, were scattered in a 30-foot radius. The heavy-duty storage container we'd secured in a tree, standard bear precaution, had been torn down, the rope cleanly snapped. This wasn't typical bear behavior. I've dealt with bear encounters before, and this was different. The destruction seemed deliberate. Dan immediately pulled out his phone to document the damage for our insurance claims. That's when we caught that smell. If you've ever been around death or decay in the woods, you know that smell. But this was different, like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Mike actually gagged. We had our night vision gear with us, standard IR monoculars we use for tracking wounded deer after sunset. I switched mine on while Dan was still filming the campsite. That's when we heard it. The sound of branches breaking, but not like when a deer moves through brush. These were big branches, breaking with purpose. Through my monocular, I saw it first, about 30 yards out, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir. The height is what hit me first. I'm 6'2", and this thing was towering, at least 7.5 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and even through the night vision, I could make out thick, dark hair covering its entire body. The way it moved was what struck me most. Fluid, deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite. I nudged Dan, who was still recording. His hand was shaking so bad you could hear his phone rattling against his jacket zipper. Mike had his rifle halfway up, but was frozen in place. We all knew shooting would be a terrible idea. That's when it did something that still haunts me. It stepped slightly out from behind the tree, and with one fluid motion, swung its arm. God, those arms were massive, and struck the trunk of the tree it was standing near. The sound was like a sledgehammer hitting wood, but louder, deeper. Then came the vocalization. I've heard mountain lions scream, bears roar, elk bugle. This was nothing like that. It was this deep, resonating sound that you felt in your chest more than heard. It started as a low rumble and built into something between a roar and a scream. I swear I could feel the ground vibrating. We didn't need to discuss our next move. We just started backing away, slowly at first, then faster, but never turning our backs. The creature stayed at the edge of our camp, occasionally shifting its weight or moving slightly behind the tree, but never fully exposing itself. It seemed more focused on asserting its territory than pursuing us. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Remember those trail cameras we had set up around camp? We'd completely forgotten about them in the chaos. When we went back the next day, in a group of 5, including 2 Forest Service rangers, We retrieved the SD cards. The footage, I've watched it probably 100 times now. It shows the creature methodically going through our camp after we left, examining our equipment with what I can only describe as curiosity. The way it handled some of our gear, picking things up, examining them, setting them down, it was disturbingly intentional. The rangers took official statements, but I could tell they were skeptical. They attributed the damage to a bear despite the footage, said the night vision and panic could have played tricks on our minds. But I know what I saw. We all do. I've been back to those woods since then, had to face that fear, but never to that specific spot. The weird thing is, in all my years hunting that area, we'd heard stories from other hunters about strange encounters, but I'd always written them off as campfire tales, or guys who'd had too much to drink. Now, I'm not so sure. The thing that really gets me, that I still can't shake, is how calculated it all felt. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. The destruction of our camp, the territorial display, the way it investigated our belongings after we left, it all seemed purposeful, intelligent, like it was sending a message. This is my territory, and you're not welcome here. I still hunt, still love being in the woods, but something changed that day. Now I'm always listening for that unnatural silence, always checking the wind for that unmistakable smell. And sometimes, when I'm out there and the forest goes quiet, I can't help but wonder if we're the ones being hunted. We tried to keep this quiet at first, worried about being labeled as crazy or attention seekers. But after seeing those trail cam videos, after experiencing what we did, I feel like I need to share this. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if I hadn't been there, hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that night in Trinity County. And it wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist, but does. The trail cam footage? We handed copies over to the rangers and a local research group, but honestly, I don't know what came of it. The original files are stored safely away. Sometimes I think about releasing them, but then I remember the look in that creature's eyes through my night vision, that unmistakable intelligence, and something holds me back. Maybe some things in those woods are better left alone, or... I've been a field geologist for over 20 years, and what I experienced in Skamania County last May has shaken everything I thought I knew about our forests. I'm writing this down because I need to process it, and because I know there are others who've seen similar things in these woods. I've always been the skeptical type. You have to be in my line of work. But there's no conventional explanation for what happened during those final days of my research trip. I was conducting a geological survey in a remote area of Skamania County, Washington. The location was about 15 miles from the nearest paved road, deep in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The closest town was Carson, but out there, you might as well have been on another planet. I'd set up a base camp near a promising outcrop of Columbia River basalt that showed some unusual weathering patterns, the kind of thing that gets geologists excited but makes everyone else's eyes glaze over. The first 2 weeks were completely normal. I'd wake up at dawn, have my coffee, and spend the day taking samples and measurements. I had a small but efficient camp, my 4-season tent, a separate tarp set up for my equipment, and my trusty old Ford F-150 parked nearby. I'd done this countless times before. Being alone in remote areas was just part of the job. The changes started subtly during the 3rd week. At first, it was just a feeling. That nagging sensation at the back of your neck when you think someone's watching you. I've encountered plenty of wildlife before, bears, cougars, you name it, but this felt different. The forest would go completely silent at random times during the day, which any outdoor person knows is a warning sign. But there was never anything there when I looked around. Then I started noticing things were being moved at night. I keep my rock samples meticulously organized. It's crucial for accurate data collection. Every morning, I'd find them slightly rearranged. Not scattered or destroyed like a bear would do, but carefully moved, as if something had been examining them. I first noticed this on Tuesday morning. I had left 6 labeled sample bags in a specific order, and they were now arranged in a rough circle. I blamed it on wind at first, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Some of those samples weighed several pounds. The sounds started 3 nights later. I'm familiar with every animal sound in these woods, but these were different. They started as deep, rumbling vocalizations that you could feel in your chest more than hear. They'd happen between 2 and 4 a.m., always when it was pitch black. The first time I heard them, I thought it was distant thunder, but the sky was clear and there wasn't a storm for hundreds of miles. I had set up 2 trail cameras and a regular security camera around my camp, standard procedure when working in bear country. The trail cams never caught anything unusual, but looking back, that itself was strange. There should have been regular wildlife activity, but the cameras only captured small animals like rabbits and raccoons. It was as if the larger animals were deliberately avoiding the camera's fields of view. The security camera was different. I had it positioned high on a tree, pointing down at my equipment area. On my last night there, May 24th, it captured something that I've replayed countless times since then, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. At 3:17 a.m., a massive figure moved into frame. The infrared lighting on the camera illuminated it clearly enough to see its basic features, but the details still haunt me. It was huge. I estimated around 8 feet tall by comparing it to my equipment cases in the frame. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. It moved bipedally, with long arms that hung below its knees. The body was covered in thick, dark hair, but it wasn't uniform like a bear's fur. What struck me most was how it moved. There was nothing animalistic about it. It showed clear purpose and intelligence. The figure spent almost 10 minutes examining my equipment. It picked up my rock samples one by one, turning them over in its hands with what I can only describe as deliberate curiosity. Its movements were careful, almost gentle. It replaced everything almost exactly as it had found it, just slightly rearranged, exactly like what I'd been finding every morning. The most chilling part was when it seemed to notice the camera. It stopped suddenly and looked directly up at it. I'll never forget those eyes reflecting the infrared light. It stood still for several seconds, then deliberately turned its back to the camera and walked away. The movement was smooth, calculated. This wasn't an animal stumbling through camp. That same night, I heard the vocalizations again, but this time they were different. Instead of the usual deep rumbles, there were distinct patterns, 3 long calls followed by 2 shorter ones, repeated several times. It sounded like communication, not random animal noises. I managed to record about 40 seconds of it on my phone, though the quality isn't great. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. About 100 yards from my camp, there was a structure made of branches, not a random tangle of fallen wood. These were deliberately woven together, forming a dome-like shape about 6 feet high. Some of the branches used were over 4 inches thick and would have required tremendous strength to bend. The structure hadn't been there the day before. I'm certain because I'd surveyed that exact area. Near the structure, I found tracks. As a geologist, I'm trained to measure and document everything. These prints were 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length was enormous, roughly 6 feet between steps. I took photos with my field notebook for scale and made plaster casts of 2 of the clearest prints. The detail in them is incredible. You can see dermal ridges like massive fingerprints. What really gets me is how it avoided my trail cameras while still leaving clear evidence of its presence. Every print, every moved object, every structure seemed purposefully placed just outside the camera's range. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was intelligence behind these actions. I packed up that morning and left. 20 years of field experience taught me when a situation isn't safe, and every instinct was telling me to go. As I was loading my truck, I heard wood knocking sounds from 3 different directions, sharp, deliberate hits that couldn't have been natural. They seemed to be coordinating, almost like they were tracking my movement. The drive out was tense. The Forest Service road was narrow and rough, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched the entire time. About 5 miles from camp, I saw something dark move through the trees parallel to my truck. It was keeping pace with me at about 25 miles per hour, which should be impossible in that terrain. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I reached Carson. I've gone over the evidence countless times since then. The video footage, the audio recordings, the plaster casts, they're all real, all documented with the same scientific rigor I apply to my geological work. I've considered every possible explanation, but nothing conventional fits. Whatever was in those woods showed intelligence, curiosity, and purpose. The strangest part, when I reported the incident to the local ranger station, they didn't seem surprised. The ranger just nodded and pulled out a thick file of similar reports from that area. Apparently, there's been a pattern of encounters in that part of Skamania County going back decades. I'm still processing what happened. I haven't gone back to that site, though I've considered it many times. My expertise is in rocks and geological formations, things that are predictable, measurable, and follow known scientific principles. What I encountered in those woods doesn't fit into any scientific framework I know, but I know what I saw, what I recorded, and what I experienced. Those woods hold secrets that we're only beginning to understand. The samples and data from that trip are still scientifically valid and valuable, but they're now secondary to what I discovered. There's something out there that demonstrates intelligence and curiosity about human activities, something that can move with shocking stealth despite its size, something that seems to understand and actively avoid our technology while still making its presence known. I've kept the exact coordinates of my campsite private, not just because I'm still processing what happened, but because I believe whatever is out there deserves its privacy. It had multiple opportunities to harm me or damage my equipment, but chose not to. Instead, it showed curiosity and what seemed like deliberate restraint. The experience has changed how I approach my field work. I still go out, still conduct my surveys, but I'm more aware now of what might be watching from the woods. Sometimes, when I'm at other remote sites, I'll hear those wood knocks or deep vocalizations in the distance. I don't run anymore. I just pack up calmly and leave. There's respect there now, an understanding that these forests hold more mysteries than my geology textbooks ever prepared me for. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but after what happened last December at our cabin in Josephine County, Oregon, I can't keep quiet anymore. My wife Sarah and I bought this place back in 2022 as a permanent home. We both work remotely and wanted to get away from city life. It's pretty isolated, about 30 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. We loved the solitude. Well, we did until last winter. It all started during that massive snowstorm that hit the Pacific Northwest in December 2023. We'd been snowed in for a couple of days, with about 3 feet of fresh powder on the ground. The first weird thing I noticed was on December 15th, when I went to check our generator and get more firewood from our stockpile. I've been around wildlife my whole life. Grew up in Montana, spent lots of time outdoors. I know what animal tracks look like, but what I saw that morning stopped me in my tracks. There were these massive footprints in the fresh snow circling our entire property. They were human-like but huge. I measured them later at 16 inches long. The stride length was insane, easily over 4 feet. Whatever made them had carefully avoided all 6 of our security cameras, staying just out of their range. That's what really got to me. This wasn't random animal movement. Whatever made these tracks knew exactly where our cameras were. I didn't tell Sarah right away. Didn't want to freak her out. I took some photos and measurements, then tried to convince myself it was just some weird snow formation, or maybe someone playing a prank, though we hadn't seen any other human tracks or vehicle marks in the snow. That night, around 2 a.m., we both woke up to this weird rhythmic thumping on the exterior walls. Not like a branch hitting the house, these were deliberate, evenly spaced knocks, moving around the perimeter of our cabin. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight she left marks. We just sat there in the dark, listening to whatever it was circling our home. The knocks would stop for maybe 5, 10 minutes, then start up again from a different location. This went on for about an hour before everything went dead quiet. When daylight came, I went outside to investigate. Nothing seemed damaged, but our woodpile had been changed. We keep about 2 cords of split wood stacked neatly against the back of the house. Someone, or something, had completely reorganized it. Instead of our normal rows, the logs were now stacked in this bizarre circular pattern with smaller pieces arranged almost like spokes of a wheel. Some of these logs weigh 50, 60 pounds each, and they'd been moved like they were Lincoln logs. The second night, same thing happened. Knocking started around 1:30 a.m. this time. Sarah wanted to call the police, but our cell service was still out from the storm, and our satellite internet was spotty at best. Plus, what would we tell them? That something was playing percussion on our house and rearranging our firewood? The next morning, the woodpile had been reorganized again, this time in a kind of pyramid structure. I found more tracks, and they were fresh. Whatever this thing was, it was coming right up to our house while we slept. I spent that day installing more security lights and cameras. But in the back of my mind, I remembered how it had avoided our other cameras. The third night, I was ready. I'm a bit of a gearhead, and I had this Gen 3 night vision monocular I'd bought for coyote hunting. Sarah thought I was crazy, but I set up in our upstairs spare room that overlooks the woodpile. Around midnight, the knocking started again. I was watching through the monocular, scanning back and forth, when I saw it. I'm still trying to process what I witnessed. This figure just emerged from the tree line. It was huge. I'd estimate at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller. It moved with this fluid grace that seemed impossible for its size. The way it walked was so human-like, but different. Longer strides, more fluid motion. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. The creature was covered in what looked like dark, thick fur. Hard to tell the exact color through night vision, but it appeared uniform across its body. Its shoulders must have been twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. What really struck me was how it moved. Purposeful, methodical, almost deliberate in every action. I watched, completely frozen, as it approached our woodpile. It started moving the logs, and the strength it displayed was unreal. Logs that I struggled to lift with both hands, it was moving effortlessly with one arm. It wasn't just randomly stacking them either. It was creating some kind of complex structure, carefully placing each piece like it was following a blueprint in its head. The strangest part, it seemed completely aware of the house, of us. Every few minutes it would stop and turn its head slightly toward our windows, as if checking if it was being watched. I swear at one point it looked directly at my window, and even through the night vision, I could tell its eyes reflected light differently than any animal I've ever seen. This went on for maybe 45 minutes. It completed whatever structure it was building, something that looked almost like a spiral from above, then just left. No rushing, no sudden movements. It just turned and walked back into the forest with that same deliberate gait. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I showed Sarah the woodpile. She broke down crying when she saw it. The structure was incredible. Logs interlocked in ways that seemed to defy gravity. Smaller pieces wedged in to support larger ones. It would have taken several people with engineering knowledge to build something like this. But here's the thing that really gets me. We checked our cameras, all of them. Nothing. Not a single frame showed anything unusual. Whatever this thing was, it had somehow known exactly where each camera's blind spots were. The snow started melting the next day, and road crews finally cleared our access road. We seriously considered leaving, but something kept us here. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stubbornness. The activity stopped as suddenly as it began. No more knocking, no more rearranged woodpiles. The only evidence we have are the photos I took of the tracks and the woodpile structures, and even those don't really convey how bizarre the whole experience was. We've talked to a few locals since then. Most just nod and change the subject, but one elderly neighbor told us that similar things have happened in these parts for generations. Something about heavy snows bringing them down from the higher elevations. I've gone back and forth about sharing this story. I know how it sounds. Trust me, if someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have thought they were making it up or had too much to drink. But I know what I saw. Sarah knows what we heard. And that woodpile. I've shown the photos to 2 different contractors, and neither can explain how those structures were built without machinery. I'm not claiming to know what visited us during those nights. I'm not even saying it was a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. All I know is that something intelligent enough to avoid our cameras, strong enough to manipulate heavy logs like toys, and deliberate enough to create complex structures spent 4 nights visiting our property. and sometimes, late at night when the wind dies down, we still hear knocking in the distance, though it hasn't come near the house again. We've decided to stay, but we've made some changes. We keep the outdoor floodlights on all night now, and I've installed more cameras, though part of me doubts they'll ever catch anything. We've also started leaving offerings, fresh fruit and nuts, at the edge of our property. I can't explain why, but it feels like the right thing to do. Maybe it's our way of acknowledging that we're the visitors here, not whatever it is that's been here all along. The weirdest part, our property feels different now, not in a threatening way, but like we're being watched over rather than watched. The other day we found our trash cans, which had been knocked over by wind, carefully set upright and the scattered trash neatly piled beside them. We've also noticed that the larger predators, the mountain lions and bears we used to see on our cameras, seem to avoid our property now. I still check the woodpile every morning, and sometimes I swear the logs have been slightly adjusted overnight, though never as dramatically as during those 4 nights. Sarah says I'm getting paranoid, but she's started leaving out extra food too. I guess we've reached a kind of understanding with whatever's out there. We respect its space and well, I'd like to think it respects ours too. This whole experience has changed how I view these forests. There's something out here, something intelligent and powerful, but not necessarily hostile. It could have easily broken into our cabin those nights, but it didn't. Instead, it chose to demonstrate its presence in a way that was impossible to ignore, but didn't put us in direct danger. Was it trying to communicate something, marking its territory, or just curious about us? I don't think I'll ever know for sure. I still use my night vision monocular to scan the tree line some nights. I haven't seen the figure again, but sometimes, just at the edge of the darkness, I catch glimpses of movement that's too fluid to be human, too deliberate to be animal. And on really quiet nights, when the snow is falling and the world feels still, we sometimes hear those rhythmic knocks echoing through the forest, like someone or something reminding us that we're not alone out here. I'm a marine biologist, specializing in anadromous fish behavior, particularly salmon migration patterns. For the past 3 years, I've been working on a long-term study of Chinook salmon populations in the Smith River system. Everything was routine until mid-April 2023, when I started noticing unusual disturbances in my research setup. It began with small things that I initially attributed to bears or other local wildlife. My fish traps were being manipulated in ways I'd never seen before. The modifications were subtle but effective, stones repositioned to create small channels, branches woven together to form crude but functional fishing weirs. What struck me as odd was the precision. Bears are intelligent, but this showed a level of deliberate manipulation I'd never encountered in my 12 years of field research. After the 3rd incident, I decided to set up additional monitoring equipment. I installed 4 high-end trail cameras with thermal imaging capabilities around my primary research area, about 15 miles upstream from the nearest town. I also set up some audio recording equipment I normally use for underwater acoustic studies. I figured if nothing else, I'd at least get some interesting wildlife footage for my department. The first 2 nights were uneventful, but on April 21st, around 2:15 a.m., everything changed. I was in my research cabin about 200 yards from the main study site, reviewing data from the previous day when my live feed monitor caught movement. What I saw still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The thermal imaging showed a massive bipedal figure moving through the water with deliberate purpose. I'm used to documenting measurements in my work, so I immediately compared it to the reference markers I've set up along the riverbank. This thing was at least 8 feet tall, not a bear, not a person in a suit. The thermal signature was consistent with a large living organism. The behavior I witnessed was what truly shocked me. This creature wasn't just wandering around, it was fishing, methodically, intelligently. It would carefully lift stones from one area of the river, create small dam-like structures, wait for fish to congregate in the resulting pools, and then catch them with movements that showed years of practiced skill. The precision was incredible. Even more astonishing was how it would meticulously return each stone to its original position afterward, something I could verify the next day because I map every aspect of my research area. The audio recordings from that night captured something that still gives me chills. At first, I thought there was interference in the equipment, but after running the audio through various analysis programs, I confirmed these were vocalizations unlike anything in our extensive database of North American wildlife sounds. They weren't random. They had structure, almost like a language, with distinct patterns that repeated at intervals. This continued for 2 more nights. Each time the figure would appear between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., engage in the same methodical fishing behavior, and disappear just before dawn. The 3rd night, I gathered enough courage to move to my observation blind about 50 yards from the river. That's when I got my closest look, and I'll never forget it. The sheer mass of the creature was intimidating, but it was the deliberate intelligence in its movements that really got to me. Its fur was dark, with a slightly reddish tint in my infrared equipment. The way it moved through water that I knew was waist-deep on me, but barely reached its knees, demonstrated its enormous size. But it was the hands that struck me most. Watching those massive, clearly articulated fingers delicately manipulating stones and constructing small dams was both fascinating and terrifying. What really stands out in my memory is the smell. Anyone who's spent time around wild animals knows they have distinct odors, but this was different. It wasn't the musky smell of a bear or the rotting fish smell you sometimes get around rivers. It was a sharp, almost chemical smell, like wet dog mixed with something metallic. The scent would come in waves, especially when the wind shifted in my direction. During my closest observation, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. The creature had just finished one of its fishing sessions and was returning stones to their original positions when it suddenly stopped and turned its head in my direction. Even though I was well hidden in my blind, upwind, and taking every precaution I knew from years of field research, somehow it sensed me. The silence that followed was deafening. All the normal nighttime forest sounds, insects, frogs, the river itself, seemed to fade away. Through my thermal scope, I could see it standing completely still, head turned toward my position. Then it made a sound that I can only describe as a deep, resonant woom-woom-woom, not loud but so low frequency that I felt it in my chest more than heard it. I stayed absolutely motionless, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it must be visible through my thermal gear. The creature remained still for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then, with a deliberateness that seemed almost ceremonial, it placed its last stone in the river, turned, and walked into the tree line. The way it moved, totally silent despite its size, defied everything I knew about large mammals. The next night, I was prepared with even more equipment, including a high-resolution thermal video camera borrowed from a colleague, but the creature never returned. Over the next few weeks, I monitored that stretch of river constantly, but there were no more incidents. The only evidence I had were the recordings and some inconclusive thermal images that could be explained away by equipment artifacts or natural phenomena. I spent months analyzing the data, running it through every filter and analysis tool I had access to. The audio recordings showed consistent patterns that didn't match any known wildlife vocalizations in our databases. The thermal imaging, while not conclusive enough to satisfy scientific scrutiny, clearly showed a large bipedal figure with heat signature patterns consistent with a living mammal. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, data, and peer-reviewed evidence. But I know what I saw those 3 nights. The level of intelligence and deliberate purpose I witnessed doesn't fit with any known species in the area. The way it carefully returned the stones to their original positions suggested not just intelligence, but a conscious effort to minimize its impact on the environment. I've struggled with whether to include this experience in my official research papers. In the end, I've kept it out. The evidence I have wouldn't stand up to peer review, and I'm not willing to risk my professional reputation. But I know what I saw, and I know that our understanding of what lives in our forests is far from complete. Since then, I've continued my research in the area, but I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes, when I'm out collecting data late at night, I'll catch that distinctive smell on the wind, or hear something that sounds like that deep, resonant call in the distance. And I wonder if it's still out there, still fishing in its methodical way, just being more careful now about being seen. I need to share what happened to me and my wife Sarah last August while we were backcountry camping in Siskiyou County, California. We're both experienced mountaineers. I've been climbing for 15 years, Sarah for 12, and we've done countless high-altitude expeditions. What we encountered up there defied everything we thought we knew about North American wildlife. It was supposed to be a standard 5-day trek through the Trinity Alps wilderness. We'd plotted a route hitting several peaks above 8,000 feet, areas we'd never explored before. The first 2 days were perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s during the day, dropping to the low 40s at night. Exactly what you want for alpine camping in August. The weird stuff started on our third morning. We woke up to find our bear canister about 30 feet from where we'd secured it the night before. At first, we thought maybe we hadn't secured it properly, but I distinctly remembered triple-checking the straps. It's something I'm obsessive about after a bad experience with bears in Yellowstone years ago. The canister was intact, but when we opened it, things inside were definitely rearranged. Some of our freeze-dried meals were opened, but surprisingly carefully, not torn apart like a bear would do. The granola bags were neatly opened at the top, almost like someone with fingers had done it. We chalked it up to a particularly clever bear and decided to be extra careful that night. We set up our camp in a small clearing near the tree line, around 7,800 feet elevation. The area had sparse vegetation, mostly stunted pines and some hardy bushes. We could see a good 100 yards in most directions, which made us feel safer. That evening, we used every bear prevention technique in the book. Double bear canisters, hung separately with complex knots I learned during advanced mountaineering courses. We even set up a makeshift alarm system with some paracord and our cooking gear. What happened that night still gives me chills. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to the sound of our alarm setup quietly clinking. We always keep our night vision monocular handy. It's expensive gear but essential for alpine starts and emergency situations. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, trying not to make any noise. What I saw through the monocular made my blood run cold. About 40 yards from our tent, illuminated in the green glow of night vision, was something huge standing upright. At first my brain tried to rationalize it as a bear, but bears don't move like this thing did. It was methodically working on the knots of our bear hang with what looked like hands. The movements were deliberate, almost human-like. The creature had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. I could judge this pretty accurately because we'd hung the bear bags at exactly 8 feet, and it barely had to reach up. I nudged Sarah awake as quietly as possible, my hand shaking as I passed her the monocular. She watched for maybe 30 seconds before grabbing my arm so hard it left marks. The creature wasn't just randomly pulling at the ropes. It was actually untying the knots one by one. These weren't simple knots either. We'd used a complicated alpine butterfly system that most humans would struggle with, especially in the dark. The way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen. Smooth, controlled movements, but with an inhuman fluidity. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. Even through the night vision, I could make out massive shoulders and a rounded, cone-shaped head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, with barely any visible neck. What really struck me was how it handled our gear. There was an intelligence there that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just yanking or using brute force, it was problem-solving. After getting the bags down, it carefully opened the bear canisters using the same technique we would, pressing the tabs and turning the lid. No random bashing or smashing like a bear would do. We lay there frozen, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. The creature methodically went through our food, but unlike a normal animal, it didn't just eat everything. It seemed to be selecting certain items. It took most of our dried fruits and nuts, but left the freeze-dried meals alone. The whole time, it moved with an awareness that suggested it knew exactly what it was doing. Just when we thought it couldn't get any more surreal, the next night proved us wrong. We'd barely slept all day, debating whether to pack up and leave, but something made us stay. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe we just needed to prove to ourselves that we hadn't imagined it. We set up a new camp about half a mile from the previous spot, this time positioning our tent where we had a clear view of the food storage area. Around the same time as the previous night, they returned. Because this time there were two of them. The same large creature from before, and alongside it, a smaller one, probably around 6 feet tall. The behavior we witnessed was astonishing. The larger one seemed to be teaching the smaller one. It would demonstrate how to work with the ropes, then step back and watch as the smaller one tried to copy the movements. When the younger one struggled with a particularly tough knot, the larger one would step in, demonstrate again, and let the smaller one try once more. The level of intelligence and social behavior we witnessed that night challenged everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. They worked together for about 45 minutes, moving with a purpose that seemed almost practiced. The younger one was clearly learning. Its movements became more confident as it successfully undid knots and opened containers. The most unnerving part? They seemed aware of our presence. At one point, the larger one turned and looked directly at our tent. I know they could probably smell us, but the way it looked in our direction, there was an awareness there that I can't explain. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. If anything, it seemed almost cautiously curious. We didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn came, we packed up camp as quickly and quietly as possible and headed back to civilization. The whole hike down, we kept looking over our shoulders, feeling watched. We found large footprints near where they had been standing. I took photos and measurements, but they don't do justice to what we saw. The prints were about 16 inches long, with clear toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like, just much larger. I've spent months trying to rationalize what we saw. Bears don't have that kind of dexterity or problem-solving ability. No known primate lives in these mountains. The deliberate movements, the teaching behavior, the manual dexterity with the knots, it all points to something far more intelligent than any recognized North American wildlife. We haven't gone back to that particular area, though I've thought about it countless times. The experience changed how we view the wilderness. There's something out there in those mountains that shouldn't exist according to any wildlife book or scientific paper, but we saw it. What haunts me isn't fear. These creatures could have easily harmed us if they wanted to, but they didn't even try. What keeps me up at night is the intelligence we witnessed. They weren't just animals foraging for food. They were beings capable of learning, teaching, and problem-solving at a level that makes me question everything I thought I knew about what exists in our wilderness. I still can't look at a climbing rope without remembering those long fingers methodically working through the knots, or set up a bear canister without wondering if somewhere out there they're teaching others how to open them too. I've never shared this story publicly before, but I think it's important to document what we saw. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, through that night vision monocular, I wouldn't believe it either. But there's something incredibly intelligent living in those mountains, something that passes down knowledge to its young, just like we do, something that watches and learns from us, adapting to our presence in ways that both fascinate and unsettle me to my core. What I witnessed last November in Jefferson County, Washington, has completely changed my understanding of our forests and what lives in them. I'm finally sharing this because I need to process what happened, and maybe someone else has seen something similar. On November 12th, 2023, I was testing out my new ATN X-Sight 4K Pro Night Vision Scope. It was a significant investment, about $700, but worth every penny for my work. I'd heard about increased elk activity near the Olympic National Forest boundary, so I figured it'd be perfect for testing the new equipment. I arrived at my usual spot off Forest Service Road 2730 around 6:15 p.m., just after sunset. The temperature was around 42 degrees Fahrenheit with a light drizzle, typical November weather for the area. I'd been to this location dozens of times before, usually photographing owls and elk. The spot is about 5 miles from the nearest paved road and maybe 8 miles from the closest town. The forest was particularly dark that night due to heavy cloud cover. The air had that damp, earthy smell that's so characteristic of PNW forests in fall: decomposing leaves, mushrooms, and wet bark. I set up my equipment on a small ridge overlooking a clearing surrounded by old-growth Douglas firs and western red cedars. The clearing was about 100 yards wide, with several fallen logs and patches of mushrooms I'd photographed before. Around 7:30 p.m., I was adjusting the settings on my scope when I noticed something odd through the viewfinder. At first, I thought it was an elk moving between the trees at the far edge of the clearing, about 100 yards away. But as I focused, I realized whatever I was looking at was walking on two legs. My heart started racing. Through the night vision scope, I could clearly see a large bipedal figure methodically moving through the clearing. The height was what struck me first. Using the trees as reference points, I estimate it was around 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms were incredibly long, reaching almost to its knees, and the shoulders were massively wide. What really got to me was how it moved. This wasn't some drunk guy in a suit stumbling around in the woods. The creature moved with purpose, stopping at specific patches of vegetation. It would kneel down, a fluid, practiced motion, and carefully examine the ground. Through my scope, I could see it was selecting certain mushrooms and plants, picking them with precision I wouldn't have expected from such large hands. The hair covering its body appeared thick and dark, maybe dark brown or black, hard to tell exact colors through night vision. It moved like someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. When it found a patch of what looked like chanterelle mushrooms, it would carefully twist them out of the ground, the proper way to harvest them, which blew my mind. It wasn't just grabbing and pulling, it was using proper foraging techniques. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my equipment several times. I managed to stabilize myself against a tree and just watched, barely breathing. The creature moved from patch to patch, sometimes picking what looked like herbs or other plants. It seemed to favor areas near the fallen logs, which makes sense as that's where many mushrooms grow. What really struck me was how it would sometimes reject certain mushrooms after examining them, even though they looked identical to ones it had picked moments before. This wasn't random foraging. It knew exactly what it wanted and what to avoid. The way it moved through the forest was incredibly quiet for something so large. Sure, I could hear branches crack occasionally under its weight, but it was surprisingly stealthy. Several times it stopped completely still, head slightly tilted, like it was listening. During these moments, I didn't dare move a muscle. I kept thinking about my truck parked about a quarter-mile back on the service road. Part of me wanted to run for it, but I knew any sudden movement might attract attention. Plus, I was witnessing something extraordinary. Despite my terror, the researcher in me knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime observation. After about 45 minutes of observation, my equipment made a low battery warning beep, a sound I'd completely forgotten about. The creature's head snapped toward my position with shocking speed. Through my scope, I could see its face clearly for the first time. It had a pronounced brow ridge, deep-set eyes that caught the infrared light in an unsettling way, and a flat, wide nose. The face was somewhere between ape and human, but somehow neither. The moment it spotted me, its entire demeanor changed. It quickly but calmly gathered the foraged items into what looked like a crude basket made of woven branches, something I hadn't noticed earlier. The level of dexterity it showed handling this basket was mind-blowing. Then it stood up to its full height. God, it was massive, and made this sound that I still have trouble describing. It wasn't aggressive like a roar or a scream. It was more like a deep, resonant whooping sound that seemed to come from deep in its chest. The sound echoed through the trees, and I heard something respond from much further away, maybe a mile or more distant. Instead of charging at me or running away, it simply turned and walked into the forest, its long strides covering ground incredibly quickly. The way it moved through the dense undergrowth was amazing. No thrashing or breaking through branches, just smooth, efficient movement, like it was walking through an empty room. I stayed frozen in place for at least another 30 minutes, fear keeping me rooted to the spot. The forest had gone completely silent. No owls, no small animals, nothing. When I finally got the courage to move, I noticed my clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cold. The next morning, I went back to the clearing. I found several clear prints in the damp ground, around 16 inches long and incredibly deep. Whatever made them was heavy. There were also broken mushroom stems where I'd seen it foraging, twisted off in exactly the way it had appeared to do through my scope. I took photos and measurements, but honestly, they don't do justice to what I witnessed. I've spent countless nights in these forests over the years, but I've never seen anything like this. The intelligence and purposefulness it displayed were far beyond what I expected. This wasn't some simple animal. It was using tools, showing knowledge of edible plants, and even practicing sustainable harvesting techniques. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't fear. It's the realization that this creature knows these forests better than we do. It's not just surviving out there, it's living with a level of sophistication we never expected. I haven't gone back to that specific spot since, but I've heard that whooping sound twice more from different locations in the area. Each time, it's been followed by a distant response. I'm still processing what I saw that night. I've heard all the Bigfoot stories over the years. I live in the Pacific Northwest, after all. But I never gave them much credence until now. What I saw wasn't a myth or a man in a suit. It was something that has evolved to live in these forests, something that understands its environment in ways we're just beginning to grasp. I've debated whether to share this experience for months. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. But I know what I saw through that scope. Whatever it was real, it was intelligent, and it's still out there, quietly going about its business in our forests. I've been a field researcher specializing in rare nocturnal birds in the Pacific Northwest for over 12 years. But what happened on February 8, 2024 in Grays Harbor County completely changed my perspective on what exists in our forests. I'm still trying to process everything I saw that night, and my hands are shaking even as I type this. My colleague Sarah, ornithologist, and Mike, audio specialist, and I were conducting our monthly northern spotted owl survey. We'd been tracking a potential mating pair in the dense forest land about 15 miles east of Aberdeen. The weather that night was unusually clear for February in Washington, around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with high humidity and just a slight breeze from the northwest. The moon was nearly full, providing decent ambient light through the canopy. We had set up our equipment at 3 different stations, forming a rough triangle, each about 300 yards apart, hoping to triangulate any owl calls. Our setup included parabolic microphones, FLIR thermal imaging cameras, and night vision equipment. Standard stuff for nocturnal bird research. We'd been at it since about 8 p.m., with nothing unusual except the forest being quieter than normal for that time of year. Around 11:45 p.m., Mike radioed from his station about picking up some unusual low-frequency sounds on his audio equipment. At first, we thought it might be interference or maybe even a bear, but the spectrograph pattern didn't match anything in our database. The vocalization was like nothing I'd ever heard in my years of field research, a deep, rhythmic whooping sound that would last for about 3-4 seconds, followed by what seemed like a response from further away. I switched on my FLIR thermal scope to scan the area between our positions. That's when I first saw it. About 150 yards to my northwest, there was a large heat signature moving through the undergrowth. At first I assumed it was a bear. We get plenty of those out here. But then it stood up. My blood ran cold. The thermal imaging clearly showed a bipedal figure that I estimate was at least 7-5 inches tall. Its thermal signature was consistent with a large, warm-blooded creature, but its movement pattern was what struck me most. This thing moved with purpose, almost methodically, weaving between the larger trees and seemingly staying just at the edge of where our equipment could detect it. I radioed Sarah and Mike to maintain absolute silence and keep their cameras trained on their sectors. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the thermal scope steady. The figure would move in an almost circular pattern, staying roughly 125 yards from our positions, but never coming closer. It was like it knew exactly where our detection perimeter was. The creature's gait was smooth but powerful, nothing like a person in a suit could replicate. Through the thermal scope, I could make out long arms that hung lower than a human's would, and what appeared to be a cone-shaped head, consistent with witness descriptions of a sagittal crest. The thermal signature suggested it was covered in thick hair or fur. What really got to me was how it would periodically stop and turn its head directly toward each of our positions, one after another, as if it was fully aware of exactly where we were. We didn't have any food out, and we were being as quiet as possible, yet it seemed to have us mapped perfectly. Around 12:15 a.m., we began picking up more vocalizations. The first would come from the direction of the creature we were observing, followed by responses from at least 2 different directions much further out. The sound was unlike anything I've encountered, deeper than a wolf or bear, with almost linguistic qualities to its rhythm. The closest I can compare it to would be very deep, resonant woodwind instrument, but even that doesn't quite capture it. We managed to record about 20 minutes of its movement patterns and several clear vocalizations. The thermal footage shows the creature methodically moving through its circuit, occasionally reaching out to touch or examine trees and vegetation. At one point, it appeared to pick something up from the ground and bring it to what I assume was its face, though the thermal resolution wasn't clear enough to make out fine details. Then, at approximately 12:35 a.m., there was a distant thunderclap from an approaching storm system. The creature immediately stopped its pattern. It turned toward the northwest, stood completely still for about 15 seconds, then moved off into the forest with surprising speed. The thermal signature disappeared into the denser parts of the forest where our equipment couldn't penetrate. The whole encounter left us shaken. We waited another hour, but the forest remained dead silent. No owls, no small mammals, nothing. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. Around 2 a.m., we agreed to pack up and head back to our base camp. The rain started just as we were loading the last of our gear. The next morning we went back to document the area. We found several broken branches high up on trees, much higher than a bear could reach. There were also some unusual depressions in the soil that had been partially washed out by the rain, but no clear footprints. The most compelling evidence was a small area where the vegetation had been recently disturbed, with several plants showing signs of having been recently pulled up and apparently examined, matching what we'd observed in the thermal footage. We submitted our audio recordings to 2 different wildlife biology labs. One suggested it could be a previously undocumented vocalization pattern from a known species, while the other declared it inconclusive. The thermal footage has been analyzed by several experts, but due to the distance and resolution limitations, they can't make any definitive statements about what we observed. I've spent my entire career in these forests. I know every animal that's supposed to be out there, their movements, their behaviors, their sounds. What we encountered that night doesn't fit any known species. The methodical movement pattern, the apparent awareness of our equipment's capabilities, the complex vocalizations, the incredible size, it all suggests something far more intelligent and elusive than any recognized Pacific Northwest wildlife. I've gone back to that area several times since then, but haven't experienced anything similar. Sometimes, when I'm out doing field research at night, I catch myself scanning the trees, wondering if something's watching me from just beyond where my instruments can detect it. The forest feels different now, bigger, more mysterious. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to find what we saw that night again. The equipment we use is specifically calibrated for our research. It's tested and verified multiple times before each expedition. 3 trained researchers witnessed the same phenomenon. The audio recordings exist, even if they're inconclusive. The thermal footage shows something that cannot be explained by any known wildlife in the area. I'm not claiming to know what we encountered, but I know what I saw. And it wasn't anything officially documented in any wildlife database I've ever worked with. I've debated sharing this experience for months, but as a scientist, I feel obligated to report observations, even when they don't fit our current understanding. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm simply sharing what 3 professional researchers experienced on a clear February night in the forests of Grays Harbor County. I live alone in a fairly remote area, about 12 miles outside of Tillamook proper. My property sits on 15 acres, backing right up against state forest land. When I retired 5 years ago, I planted a decent-sized orchard, mostly apple and pear trees, with some plum and cherry trees too. It's been my pride and joy watching those trees grow and finally start producing good fruit. Everything was normal until June 12th. That evening, I was doing my usual check of the property before turning in. I have security cameras set up around the orchard, mainly to keep track of any deer or elk that might damage the trees. While reviewing the footage from the previous night, I noticed something odd. Several of my ripest Bartlett pear trees had been picked clean, but only the perfectly ripe fruit was taken. No broken branches, no damaged trees, just clean picking of the ready fruit. At first I assumed it was bears. We get them occasionally. But bears are messy eaters. They damage branches and leave half-eaten fruit everywhere. This was different. I decided to check the camera footage more carefully. What I saw at 2:17 a.m. made my blood run cold. The infrared camera had captured something massive moving through my orchard. I've been around black bears my entire career. This was no bear. The figure was clearly bipedal, and based on the reference points I know in my orchard, had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its movements were deliberate and almost human-like in their precision. It would carefully examine each pear, picking only those that were perfectly ripe, placing them gently into what looked like some kind of crude basket made from woven branches. I've always been a skeptic about Bigfoot. Even with all my years in the Forest Service, I'd dismissed most stories as misidentifications or hoaxes. But watching this footage, seeing this creature moving with such intelligence and purpose, it shook everything I thought I knew. The next night, I made sure all cameras were recording and even set up 2 additional ones I had in storage. Sure enough, at almost the exact same time, 2:23 a.m., the creature returned. This time it focused on my apple trees, again showing an uncanny knowledge of which fruit was ready for picking. I could see it clearly testing each apple with gentle pressure from what appeared to be massive, hair-covered hands. The detail that really got to me was how it moved. Despite its enormous size, it was incredibly gentle with the branches. Anyone who's picked fruit knows how easy it is to accidentally snap small branches or knock off unripe fruit. This thing moved with the expertise of a master gardener. The third night, I decided to do something that probably wasn't too smart. I left out a large basket of perfectly ripe pears and apples on a wooden table near the edge of the orchard. I also set up a new camera focused directly on this area. The creature came again, right on schedule, but it didn't immediately approach the fruit. For almost 45 minutes, it stayed at the tree line, observing. I could see its massive silhouette, occasionally shifting position, studying the offering. Finally, it approached the table. In the infrared footage, I could make out more details than ever before. The hair covering its body was thick and shaggy, but not matted or unkempt. Its face was largely obscured by hair, but I could see eyes reflecting in the infrared light. They showed an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. It carefully inspected each piece of fruit in the basket, taking some but leaving others. Before it left, it did something that I still can't fully process. It arranged some of the rejected fruit in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. The fourth night brought the strangest development yet. When I checked my property in the morning, I found elaborate structures made from broken branches near where I'd left the fruit basket. They weren't random. The branches were clearly woven together in complex patterns, some standing nearly 6 feet tall. In my 3 decades as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. They reminded me of the way some native cultures create temporary shelters, but these weren't shelters. They seemed more like messages. By the 5th night, I was barely sleeping. I'd spend hours watching the live feed from my cameras, jumping at every shadow. The creature returned, this time staying for nearly 2 hours. It created more branch structures, this time placing fruit within them in specific patterns. The level of intelligence and deliberation in its actions was undeniable. What really disturbs me is the way it seemed to be aware of the cameras. Several times it would stop what it was doing and look directly into them, but never made any attempt to damage or disable them. It's like it was letting me know it knew it was being watched and was okay with it. The whole experience came to an abrupt end after that 5th night. The creature never returned, at least not to my orchard, but it left behind evidence I can't explain away. The branch structures, which I photographed extensively, clear footprints in some muddy areas, measuring 17 inches long, and hours of video footage that I've reviewed countless times. The footprints were what finally made me reach out to a local wildlife biologist. He came out to my property, listened to my story, examined the evidence, and took several samples of hair we found caught in the bark of some trees. He seemed skeptical at first, but became increasingly quiet as he reviewed my footage. He took copies of everything, but I haven't heard back from him since his initial visit. I've struggled with whether to share this experience. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have dismissed it. But I know what I saw. I have the footage, the structures, the photographs. What really keeps me up at night isn't fear of the creature. It never showed any aggression or threatening behavior. What haunts me is the clear intelligence it displayed, the careful deliberation in its actions, the apparent attempt at communication through those branch structures. The part that really gets to me even now is how it seemed to understand the concept of cultivated fruit. It knew not just which fruit was ripe, but how to harvest it without damaging the trees. That speaks to a level of intelligence and knowledge that goes beyond what we typically attribute to wildlife. This wasn't just an animal following instinct. This was something that understood agriculture, at least on a basic level. I've gone back and forth about what to do with the footage. Part of me wants to share it publicly, but I've seen how these things typically play out. I'm not interested in having my property overrun with curiosity seekers or becoming the target of ridicule. For now, I've secured the footage and evidence, made multiple backups, and shared copies with a few trusted friends. Sometimes, especially on quiet nights, I still sit out near my orchard, watching and waiting. The creature never returned after those 5 nights, but it left behind more than just physical evidence. It left me with questions I don't think I'll ever be able to answer. What was it? Why did it choose my orchard? Was it trying to communicate something with those branch structures? The rational part of my mind wants to find some logical explanation, but I know what I saw. Those 5 nights in June changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in our forests. The most frustrating part is that despite my years of experience, despite the footage and physical evidence, I still don't have answers. Just more questions. I've started keeping a more detailed journal of everything that happens on my property, and I've upgraded my camera system, but part of me knows that whatever I encountered during those 5 nights might never return. Maybe that's for the best, but I can't help hoping that someday it might come back, and this time I might learn more about what it really was.